2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire stood at the height of its power. From the crowded streets of Rome to the farthest edges of its provinces, life unfolded in the shadow of grand temples, bustling markets, and mighty legions. This is the story of ordinary citizens and powerful rulers, of merchants, soldiers, farmers, and slaves, all living in a world shaped by Rome's ambition, wealth, and order. Step into the heart of the empire, and witness what life was truly like during its golden age. Life during the peak of the Roman Empire. The sun was only beginning to rise above the horizon, but already the great city of Rome stirred with life. A pale orange light spread slowly across the tiled rooftops, creeping down the hillsides and gilding the marble columns of temples, making them gleam as if they were on fire. From the Palatine, the palaces of emperors caught the dawn, their windows glittering with reflections of gold and glass. On the Capitoline, the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus loomed in majesty, its statues looming like sentinels over the city below. In every direction, stone and marble shone with the promise of another day. For those who lived in Rome, whether rich patrician or struggling plebeian, morning was both a renewal and a challenge. It was a city that never truly slept, but rather shifted in its rhythms, from the torchlit revels of the night to the cries of hawkers and the tramp of feet that greeted the dawn. Marcus Flavius Severus awoke to the familiar chorus of the Subura district, the clattering of wagon wheels on cobblestone, the bray of mules being driven toward the forum, the sharp call of a breadseller announcing his loaves fresh from the oven. His insula, one of the towering apartment blocks that dominated the poorer quarters, trembled faintly with the weight of people moving about within it. Families bustled in cramped spaces, slaves hurried down stairways with amphorae on their shoulders, and children darted through narrow corridors already laughing and shouting. The building groaned with life, precarious yet enduring, much like Rome itself. Rubbing sleep from his eyes, Marcus stepped onto the small wooden balcony outside his apartment and breathed deeply. The morning air was cool, tinged with the smell of hearth smoke and the sour reek that never fully left the Subura. From here, he could see the maze of roofs and alleys stretching out toward the forum. Somewhere beyond, the Tiber caught the rising light, its slow-moving waters glinting like molten bronze. Barges were already making their way upriver from Ostia, loaded with sacks of Egyptian grain, amphorae of African oil, and the countless other goods that kept Rome fed and clothed. The sight stirred Marcus with familiar pride. This was the heart of the world, the city whose reach stretched to the edges of the earth. And he was part of it, small though his role might be, as a merchant who dealt in the lifeblood of trade. Inside, his wife Livia was arranging the morning meal on a low table. Coarse bread from yesterday's bake, a bowl of olives and a small wedge of cheese. She moved with quiet efficiency, her dark hair tied back neatly, her face serene despite the constant demands of household life. Livia was not born to wealth, but she possessed a shrewd mind and a steady hand, qualities that Marcus valued as much as affection. She kept the household accounts with care, stretching every denarius as far as it would go, and she ensured that their children's education was never neglected. Their son, little Quintus, 10 years old, had begun lessons in reading and rhetoric with a Greek tutor, a freedman whose knowledge far outstripped his status. Their daughter, Julia, only 7, was learning the traditional skills expected of Roman women: spinning, weaving, household management, but Livia, quietly rebellious in her own way, encouraged her also to read the children's scrolls that Quintus used. Marcus sat with them briefly, tearing a piece of bread and dipping it into oil before taking a slow bite. The taste was sharp but comforting, familiar as the rhythm of breath. He exchanged a few words with his children, listening with pride as Quintus recited a line of Latin verse he had memorized, before rising to begin his day's work. Livia offered him a small smile as he adjusted his tunic and fastened his sandals, her eyes betraying the unspoken worries of a wife who knew how uncertain fortune could be in the city. Descending the narrow staircase of the insula, Marcus emerged into the street just as the neighborhood fully awakened. The alley was a confusion of sound and smell, vendors shouting as they laid out wares, children dashing between carts, the bleating of goats being driven toward the markets. Water sellers trudged past with their yokes, sloshing buckets carried from the nearest fountain. The smell of fresh bread mingled with the stench of refuse piled in corners, reminders of the city's vastness and its imperfections. Rome was glory and filth woven together in a single tapestry, and its people accepted both as the price of living in the greatest city on earth. Marcus walked briskly toward the Forum Boarium, where his small shop stood. Along the way, he passed shrines tucked into street corners, where neighbors paused to scatter grains of incense or whisper a prayer to the household gods. Religion was not confined to the grandeur of marble temples but infused into every moment of daily life. A quick invocation to Mercury might ensure fair trade, or a word to Fortuna might tilt luck in one's favor. Marcus, like most Romans, was neither zealot nor skeptic. He honored the gods because life was unpredictable, and their favor, however uncertain, was always worth seeking. As he reached the Forum Boarium, the marketplace by the Tiber, the city seemed to throb with energy. It was here that Rome's role as the heart of the empire was most visible. Merchants called out in 100 accents, displaying goods from every corner of the known world. Egyptian papyrus and grain, African ivory and oil, Spanish silver, Gallic pottery, Greek wines, silks from Parthia, all found their way to Roman hands. The air buzzed with bargaining, the clink of coins and the sharp tang of garum, the fermented fish sauce beloved and despised in equal measure, that wafted from a nearby stall. Marcus opened the wooden shutters of his shop and set out the amphory of oil he had imported, assisted by Publius, a young slave boy who worked quickly under his direction. The marketplace was a theater of humanity. Senators in pristine togas walked with their entourages of clients, bestowing brief words or nods that bound men to their patronage. Freedmen like Marcus negotiated loudly, gesturing with animated hands as they haggled over prices. Slaves darted through the crowd with baskets or jars, often unnoticed except when they stumbled. Beggars lingered near the temples, stretching out hands for alms with pitiful cries. Over it all loomed the marble columns of shrines and temples, where priests in spotless robes prepared sacrifices for the day. Marcus glanced across the square just as a bull, its horns gilded, was led toward the altar of Hercules. The crowd murmured in anticipation, some with reverence, others with the casual indifference of routine. The gods must be honored, and Rome never ceased to honor them. Business was steady that morning. A baker purchased oil in bulk, grumbling about rising prices. A tavern keeper bought grain, his laughter booming as he bargained Marcus down by a few sesterces. A soldier on leave came for a jar of oil, speaking with the clipped tone of one accustomed to command, and told Marcus briefly of service along the Danube frontier. The man spoke of barbarians restless beyond the borders, of forts rising like outposts of civilization in hostile lands. Marcus listened with polite interest, though such stories were common. Rome was always at war somewhere, and yet here in the capital, the empire's troubles felt distant, muffled by the weight of its power. At midday the sun beat down fiercely, and the market slowed as men sought shade. Marcus sat beneath the portico of his shop and ate a simple meal, bread dipped in oil, watered wine from a clay cup. He watched the city flow past him, endlessly fascinating. A group of street performers played pipes and drums, drawing laughter from a gathering of children. A magistrate in a striped toga moved through the crowd, flanked by lictors carrying the fasces as symbols of authority. The hum of voices rose and fell like waves, and Marcus felt, as he often did, that the city itself was a living being, breathing, pulsing, ever hungry. By afternoon, with his trade concluded for the day, Marcus closed his stall and made his way to the baths of Agrippa. The grand complex was one of Rome's finest, a marvel of architecture where citizens of every rank gathered. The air was thick with steam, scented faintly with oils. Men reclined in the tepidarium, debating politics in low voices. In the caldarium, sweat poured from bodies gleaming with heat. In the frigidarium, shouts echoed as bathers plunged into the cold pool, gasping with shock before laughing together. Here, Marcus encountered an old acquaintance, Gaius Julius Varro, a weathered veteran whose body bore scars from campaigns in Germania. They spoke of family, of business, and inevitably of the empire. Varro's voice carried both pride and bitterness. Pride in the legions that had carried Rome's eagle standards across the world, bitterness at senators whom he dismissed as decadent, detached from the hardships of soldiers. Marcus nodded politely, careful not to speak too freely. Rome was a place where words carried consequences, and loyalty to the emperor was as much survival as conviction. When the sun finally sank low, Marcus returned home. The streets glowed with torchlight, laughter spilling from taverns, music drifting through the alleys. Supper awaited him, lentils, bread, a little fish, and afterward the family sat together, speaking quietly in the dim light of oil lamps. Outside, the city's hum softened into a deep murmur, as though the stones themselves were settling into rest. Lying down at last, Marcus thought not of the distant frontiers or the grandeur of emperors but of his family, his trade, his place in the endless rhythm of the city. Beyond the window, the Tiber flowed steadily under the moonlight, carrying with it the lifeblood of the empire. Rome endured, as it always had, and within its walls, millions of lives unfolded in small but significant ways. For Marcus, for Livia, for Quintus and Julia, This was life at the peak of the Roman Empire, not extraordinary, not ignoble, but part of the vast, intricate fabric of a world that believed itself eternal. The city never truly slept, but mornings belonged to the household, and in the apartment of Marcus Flavius Severus, that household stirred with its own quiet rhythm. After Marcus had left for the Forum Boarium, the insula seemed to breathe differently. The sounds of the street below still floated upward, vendors shouting, carts rattling, beggars crying out, but inside the space belonged to Livia and the children. She moved about the dimly lit apartment with steady hands, her eyes constantly darting to the little details that held her family's life together. The wax tablets on which accounts were tallied, the storage jars tucked carefully against the wall, the scraps of cloth that Julia had been practicing with on her loom. Their apartment was not luxurious, but it was more spacious than many. The walls were plastered, the floors covered in simple tiles, and the windows, small and narrow, let in streams of dusty sunlight. A bronze lamp sat on a low table, its wick blackened from use. The smell of olive oil lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of wool, smoke, and the neighbors cooking from other rooms. In this space, lives unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, yet these domestic rhythms were as vital to Rome as the clamorous debates in the Senate or the grand processions in the Forum. Quintus, their 10-year-old son, sat cross-legged near the window, squinting over a wax tablet as his tutor dictated lines of Virgil. The tutor, a Greek freedman named Theon, had once been a slave in a senator's household but had earned his freedom by skill and diligence. Now he hired himself out to families who could not afford the elite schools but still desired proper education for their sons. He had a narrow face, sharp eyes, and a voice that could slice through distraction like a knife. "Write it again," Theon said firmly, tapping his reed stylus against the edge of the tablet. Aeneas did not hesitate, and neither should you. Let your hand follow the words as though it were a soldier following orders. Quintus frowned, pressing the stylus into the soft wax with exaggerated effort. He had a sharp mind, but like many boys, his attention wandered. His thoughts drifted easily to games in the street or the thrill of watching soldiers march past in gleaming armor. Yet under Theon's stern guidance, he bent once more to the task, scratching out the familiar lines. "Arma virum cano," he murmured, his small voice echoing the opening of Rome's great epic. In the corner of the room, Julia watched her brother with interest as she worked the loom under her mother's eye. Her fingers moved clumsily but earnestly, tugging threads and trying to maintain the pattern Livia had shown her. At 7, Julia's world was one of imitation, copying her mother's movements, echoing her words, absorbing the unspoken rules of a society that expected women to rule households but not public life. Yet Julia's eyes lingered on the scrolls her brother used. She envied the neat rows of letters, the mysterious signs that unlocked worlds of stories. When Livia's back was turned, she sometimes whispered the words Quintus repeated, her lips shaping them with secret delight. Livia noticed, of course. She always noticed. Though she said nothing, a flicker of pride warmed her heart. She herself had learned letters only through determination and the indulgence of an older brother, long before marriage had bound her life to Marcus. Many women in Rome were content with ignorance, managing kitchens and servants with practical skill, but Livia believed knowledge was a kind of power, not the kind wielded in the Senate or on the battlefield, but the quieter power of understanding the world more deeply. By mid-morning, Theon dismissed Quintus to practice his recitations aloud. The boy leapt at the chance to stretch his legs, pacing the room with youthful energy as he declaimed in sing-song Latin. Theon watched him with a critical eye, occasionally correcting a mispronounced syllable or urging him to speak with more conviction. Livia, meanwhile, guided Julia through the motions of household tasks, grinding grain with a small hand mill, mixing water with wine for the midday meal, folding and arranging cloth. These tasks seemed humble, but they were the foundation of Roman life. The empire might conquer provinces and build aqueducts, but within the walls of every home, it was the daily labors of women and children that sustained families. Later, as the sun climbed higher and light poured harshly into the streets, Livia led her children to the nearest fountain. The insula's upper floors had no direct access to water, so each day she, like countless other Roman women, carried jars to the public fountains fed by aqueducts. The aqueducts themselves were marvels of engineering, stone arches stretching for miles across the countryside, channeling pure water into the city. Yet the labor of collecting and carrying that water fell to the ordinary citizens. Julia skipped at her mother's side, holding a small jug that was more a toy than a necessity, while Quintus tried to appear serious as he carried a larger jar, his arms straining under the weight. The fountain was crowded. Women and slaves jostled for space, filling buckets and jars, gossiping loudly as they worked. News spread quickly at these gatherings. Rumors of a new edict from the emperor, whispers of unrest in distant provinces, stories of neighbors' misfortunes or successes. Today, the talk was of a senator's lavish banquet, where exotic animals had been slaughtered for spectacle, and of the latest gladiatorial games promised for the coming festival. Julia listened wide-eyed, though she understood little. Quintus tried to appear uninterested, though the mention of gladiators made his heart beat faster. Carrying the heavy jars back through the streets was slow work. Vendors shouted from stalls, hawking figs, dates, honey cakes, and roasted nuts. The smell of cooked meat drifted from taverns, mingling with the sharper tang of fish sauce. Beggars reached out with skeletal hands, muttering pleas. The children stared, torn between fear and pity, until Livia urged them gently forward. Rome's wealth was dazzling, but its poverty was never hidden. Back at the apartment, they set the jars down with relief. Livia poured water into a bronze basin, washing her hands before preparing the midday meal. The family's food was simple: lentils stewed with onions, a piece of salted fish, bread to soak up the broth. The children ate eagerly, their chatter filling the room, while Theon joined them, speaking between bites about philosophy and the virtues of discipline. "A man is not truly free," he declared, "unless he has learned to master himself." Quintus rolled his eyes but kept chewing. Julia tilted her head, wondering what mastery of oneself meant for a girl who would one day be married into another household. After the meal, the apartment grew quiet in the heat of midday. Many Romans rested during these hours, the city itself slowing as the sun blazed overhead. Livia sat near the window, mending a tunic, while Julia dozed on a mat and Quintus whispered lines of poetry under his breath. Theon excused himself, heading off to another family, leaving the children in their mother's care. Outside, the noise of the street softened to a drowsy hum, punctuated by the occasional cry of a fruit seller or the clatter of a passing cart. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the rhythm of the household changed once again. Livia guided Julia back to her loom, encouraging her to weave evenly, while Quintus was allowed to join his friends in the alley below. The boy dashed down the stairs, bursting into the street with energy pent up all day. There, among the rough stones and crowded tenements, children played their games, rolling hoops, tossing nuts as dice, drawing lines in dust for improvised contests. They argued, laughed, and chased one another, their voices rising above the noise of the city. For Quintus, these games were training grounds where victories and defeats, however small, tasted like the triumphs of heroes. Julia watched from the balcony above, longing to join them. Yet girls' games were different, quieter, confined, watched over by mothers. She traced the shapes of letters on the wooden railing, whispering them like spells, dreaming of a day when she might hold a scroll of her own. Livia glanced at her daughter, recognizing the hunger in her eyes, and said nothing. Some dreams could not yet be spoken aloud, but they flickered, alive, within the walls of every home. When Marcus returned at last from the market, tired but content, the family gathered once more. Supper was simple as always but rich in companionship. They spoke of the day, Marcus of the bustle of the Forum Boarium, Livia of the fountain and the gossip of neighbors, Quintus of his games, Julia of her weaving. The lamps flickered, casting long shadows on the plastered walls, while outside Rome's endless murmur filled the night. And so the day closed in the insula of Marcus Flavius Severus, not with grandeur or spectacle, but with the small, steady patterns that gave shape to life. For in the heart of the empire, beneath the roar of politics and the march of legions, it was in these quiet households that Rome endured. The empire's strength was not only in its armies or its wealth, but in the families who rose each morning, tended their duties, and laid their heads to rest each night, believing that tomorrow as ever the city would awaken again. The morning of the games dawned with unusual excitement. Word had spread for weeks that the emperor himself had promised a lavish spectacle in the Colosseum, the great amphitheater whose stone arches dominated the heart of Rome. Even before the sun rose fully above the horizon, streams of people poured through the streets toward the vast arena. Senators in their gleaming white togas, merchants in worn tunics, slaves bearing stools or baskets of food for their masters, beggars hoping for scraps, and children running ahead of their parents, their voices shrill with anticipation. Rome's appetite for blood and glory was insatiable, and today it would be fed. Marcus Flavius Severus had promised his son, Quintus, that he would take him to see the games. It was a gift of sorts, a reward for the boy's diligence in his studies. Marcus himself had mixed feelings about the amphitheater. He admired its grandeur, respected its place in the civic life of the city, yet recoiled privately from its cruelty. Still, Rome was Rome, and no boy could grow up in the capital without tasting the spectacle that defined its spirit. Livia had pursed her lips when Marcus announced his intention, but she had not forbidden it. She knew as he did, that Quintus would remember the day all his life. They left their insula early, joining the crowd flowing through the narrow streets. Quintus clutched his father's hand tightly, his eyes darting from the vendors selling small clay figurines of gladiators to the slaves carrying garlands of flowers meant to decorate the seats of noble patrons. The smell of roasted meat wafted through the air, mingled with the sour tang of spilled wine and the sweat of thousands of bodies pressing forward. The closer they came to the Colosseum, the louder the hum of voices grew, rising into a roar that seemed to reverberate off the very stones. The amphitheater itself was a marvel. Rising over 150 feet into the air, its tiers of arches stretched in perfect symmetry around the oval arena. Marble statues filled the niches, banners fluttered from poles, and the sheer scale of the structure dwarfed everything around it. For Quintus, it was like stepping into the presence of a god. His mouth fell open as he craned his neck upward, trying to take in its immensity. Marcus smiled faintly, remembering his own first visit many years before, when the Colosseum had seemed a wonder beyond comprehension. They entered through one of the many gates, their wooden tickets guiding them to their section. Rome's strict social order was reflected in the seating. Senators and magistrates nearest the arena, knights just behind them, ordinary citizens further back, and women and slaves relegated to the highest tiers. Marcus, a respectable plebeian merchant, took his place with Quintus in the middle rows, high enough for safety but close enough to see the action clearly. Around them, the seats filled rapidly, the murmur of the crowd swelling into thunder. The amphitheater could hold 50,000 souls, and today, every seat seemed destined to be filled. The games began with a procession. Trumpets blared, their sharp notes cutting through the noise. From the gates at the far end of the arena, officials entered in stately order, followed by gladiators in gleaming armor. The crowd erupted in cheers, whistles, and shouts of encouragement. Some gladiators lifted their weapons high, basking in the adoration. Others kept their eyes down, their faces grim. Behind them came hunters leading exotic animals. Leopards, bears, even a pair of lions that prowled restlessly in their cages, their golden eyes burning with fury. Quintus gripped his father's arm, his breath quickening. The editor of the games, a wealthy senator seeking the people's favor, stood and addressed the crowd. His words were drowned in the roar of approval, but his gesture spoke clearly enough. He promised grandeur, excitement, and blood. Then, with a signal, the first events began. The morning was devoted to venations, the hunts. The gates clanged open and wild beasts were released into the arena. Hunters armed with spears and nets pursued them, their movements swift and precise. The crowd gasped as a leopard leapt at a man, only to be skewered in midair. Blood stained the sand, bright and shocking in the sunlight. Quintus's eyes widened in horror and fascination, while Marcus forced himself to watch calmly, reminding himself that this was the world his son must grow into. Lions tore at slaves condemned to death, their screams cut short by savage jaws. Bears fell beneath showers of spears, their massive bodies convulsing before growing still. The arena became a theater of death, and the crowd loved every moment. By midday the hunts ended, and attendants raked fresh sand across the blood-soaked ground. Vendors circulated among the tiers, selling bread, fruit, wine, and pastries. Quintus gnawed on a honey cake, his face pale but his eyes bright. He asked his father endless questions about the gladiators, where they came from, how they trained, whether they could ever win their freedom. Marcus answered patiently, though he himself wondered at the contradictions. Men revered as heroes, yet condemned to fight like beasts for the amusement of the crowd. The afternoon brought the main event, the gladiatorial combats. The crowd hushed with anticipation as pairs of fighters entered the arena. Each wore distinct armor that marked his class, the heavily armed Mirmillo with his broad shield and sword, the nimble Retiarius with net and trident, the Secutor with smooth helmet and curved blade. The crowd shouted names, wagering loudly on favorites, their voices merging into a chaotic roar. The first match was swift. A Mirmillo drove his blade into a lightly armed opponent, who collapsed, blood streaming into the sand. The fallen man raised a finger, begging for mercy. The victor stepped back, looking toward the podium where the editor of the games waited for the crowd's verdict. Thousands of voices screamed at once, some calling for mercy, others for death. The editor hesitated, then turned his thumb downward. The victor plunged his sword into the defeated man's throat, and the arena exploded in cheers. Quintus flinched but did not look away. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he kept his face steady. Match after match followed. Some were clumsy, ending quickly in death. Others were drawn out, displays of skill that left the crowd on its feet, shouting wildly. One Retiarius tangled his opponent's legs in his net, dragging him to the ground before driving his trident deep into the man's chest. Another pair fought so evenly that when one finally fell, the editor granted him mercy, and the crowd roared with approval. To the people of Rome, this was justice, theater, and religion all in one. Life and death in the hands of fate, the gods, and the voice of the people. As the sun sank lower, the final match of the day began. Two champions, veterans of many combats, faced each other in the golden light. The crowd fell into a tense silence, broken only by the clash of sword against shield, the grunt of effort, the scrape of sand under sandals. They fought like titans, every movement honed by years of survival. Sweat poured from their bodies, their muscles straining with each strike. Quintus leaned forward, his heart racing, his hands clenched into fists. The fight ended suddenly with a burst of speed from the Murmillo. His sword drove beneath his opponent's guard, piercing his side. The man staggered, blood flowing freely, but remained standing, defiance blazing in his eyes. He raised his finger, calling for mercy. The Murmillo stepped back, chest heaving, waiting. All eyes turned to the editor, whose hand hovered uncertainly. The crowd screamed, divided in its demand. Some wanted death, others mercy. At last, the editor raised his hand flat, granting life. Relief swept the arena, mingled with disappointment. The defeated gladiator was carried out, spared to fight another day. As the games ended, the crowd poured out of the Colosseum, still buzzing with excitement. Quintus chattered endlessly, recounting every moment, every strike, his voice alive with wonder. Marcus listened, smiling faintly, though his heart was heavy. He had seen the hunger in his son's eyes, the fascination with blood and glory. It was the same hunger that had driven generations of Romans to conquer the world, the same hunger that fed the empire's endless appetite for spectacle. They walked home through streets still echoing with celebration. Vendors sold souvenirs, singers performed songs about the day's heroes, children swung wooden swords in mock battles. Quintus begged his father for a toy shield, and Marcus bought it, unable to deny him. As the boy brandished it proudly, Marcus thought of the future, the world his son would inherit, the empire that seemed eternal yet was always fragile beneath its marble surface. When they reached their insula, Livia was waiting. She looked into her son's shining eyes, then into her husband's weary ones, and said nothing. The family sat together that evening, eating in silence broken only by Quintus's excited retelling of the battles. Outside, Rome's noise rumbled on, eternal, unyielding, its heart beating in blood and sand. The morning sun was already high when Marcus Flavius Severus found himself walking toward the Forum Romanum. His business for the day was not trade. He had closed his shop early, entrusting it to Publius, the young slave boy, while he attended to a more unusual matter. A fellow merchant, an old acquaintance from the marketplace, had invited him to accompany him to the Curia Julia, the grand building where the Senate convened. It was not common for ordinary men of Marcus's rank to enter that space, but favors and friendships often opened doors in Rome. The prospect both thrilled and unsettled him. The Forum spread before him like the beating heart of the city. Marble temples loomed on every side, their steps thronged with worshippers and petitioners. Vendors set up stalls in every available corner, hawking figs, honey cakes, scrolls of cheap literature, even amulets said to bring luck in business or love. The rostra, the great speaker's platform, stood near the center, its bronze plaques gleaming in the sunlight. Crowds pressed close as orators harangued them with speeches, some earnest, some theatrical, while listeners shouted back approval or scorn. For Marcus, who spent most of his days in the narrower confines of the Forum Boarium, the Forum Romanum was overwhelming, a theater of power where the voices of men carried the weight of law and destiny. His acquaintance, Lucius Aelius Rufus, greeted him with a broad smile. Lucius was wealthier than Marcus, a merchant whose ships sailed regularly from Ostia to Alexandria, bringing grain and papyrus. His tunic was finer, his sandals newer, his confidence unmistakable. "Come, Marcus," he said warmly, clapping him on the shoulder. "Today you will see the Senate in all its grandeur. Perhaps it will remind you that Rome is not only trade and toil, but wisdom and order." They made their way toward the Curia Julia, the Senate house built by Julius Caesar and completed under Augustus. Its massive doors of bronze stood open, guarded by lictors bearing the fasces, the rods and axes that symbolized authority. The building itself was severe in its simplicity, tall, rectangular, unadorned compared to the ornate temples nearby. Yet its very austerity spoke of power, as though it had no need of decoration to command respect. Marcus felt a shiver as he passed within, leaving behind the clamor of the forum for the hushed solemnity of Rome's inner chamber. Inside, the hall was vast and echoing, its walls lined with marble, its roof high above supported by coffered beams. Rows of stone benches stretched in semicircles, filled already with senators in their gleaming white togas bordered with purple. The air smelled faintly of wax and incense, mixed with the human odor of hundreds of men gathered together. At the far end, on a raised platform, sat the presiding magistrates, flanked by scribes and attendants. Every movement, every murmur seemed magnified by the space, as though the very stones listened. Marcus and Lucius took their places quietly at the back, among the few allowed to observe. The senators' voices filled the chamber, rising and falling with rhythm and passion. The day's debate concerned a matter far from Rome: reports of unrest along the Rhine frontier, where Germanic tribes had raided across the river. Some senators urged immediate reinforcement of the legions, warning that delay might embolden the barbarians. Others argued that the matter was exaggerated, that costly campaigns drained the treasury and distracted from the city's needs. One senator, an elderly man with a voice like iron, rose to speak. He struck the air with his hand as he described the danger of complacency, his words echoing off the marble walls. "Rome does not endure because her enemies sleep," he declared. "She endures because she rises before they do. If we falter even for a moment, the barbarians will sense weakness. Shall we leave the Rhine to tremble while we fatten ourselves here on luxury? No. The eagle must always be in flight." The chamber erupted in applause and cries of support, though others muttered dissent. Another senator, younger, sleek, his toga immaculate, countered with equal fervor. "Do you speak of luxury, old man, while you demand endless wars that bleed our coffers dry? Rome's strength lies not only in swords but in wealth, trade, and stability. Shall we tax the people further, burden the provinces more heavily, simply to chase shadows in the forests of Germania? Let prudence guide us, not fear. Let us secure the grain ships, the aqueducts, the roads. Without them, our swords are nothing but iron." His words drew cheers from many, boos from others. Marcus listened, transfixed. These were not his battles. His world was measured in amphorae and denarii, not provinces and legions. Yet as the debate raged, he felt the weight of their words pressing on him. Every decision here, every raised voice, rippled outward to touch the lives of men like him, whether in the price of grain, the safety of the roads, or the taxes collected by officials. He thought of Quintus, of Julia, of the future they would inherit, and realized that this chamber, for all its distance from their insula, shaped their lives more than the marketplace ever could. The debate continued for hours. Voices rose in anger, hands gestured, faces flushed with passion. Some spoke with eloquence that stirred the heart, others droned with tedious detail, citing figures and precedents. The presiding magistrates listened, occasionally interjecting, but mostly letting the storm play out. It was not chaos, Marcus realized, but a kind of ordered contest like the gladiators in the arena. Each man fought not with sword and shield, but with words sharpened into weapons. At last, a consensus was reached. Reinforcements would be sent to the Rhine, but limited in number, and accompanied by envoys tasked with negotiating with the tribes. It was a compromise that satisfied no one entirely, but it was the Roman way, pragmatic, measured, bending without breaking. The scribes recorded the decision, the magistrates announced it, and the Senate moved on to other matters. For Marcus, however, the impression remained. Rome's power lay not only in her armies, but in this ceaseless argument, this endless weighing of voices that somehow, against all odds, forged direction out of discord. When the session ended, senators filed out into the sunlight, their entourages of clients awaiting them. The forum buzzed anew with gossip about the debate, rumors of who had spoken most persuasively, predictions about what the emperor himself might decide when the news reached him. Marcus and Lucius followed, swept up in the tide of humanity that flowed around the temples and basilicas. Lucius clapped his friend on the back. "Well, Marcus, what did you think? Are you not proud to live in the city where such matters are decided? Where the fate of provinces, the lives of legions, are debated as though they were pieces on a board?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "But it is strange to see how much depends on words, on the turn of a phrase, on the passion of a voice. I had thought Rome's strength was in her soldiers, her walls, her ships. But perhaps it is also in this, that men argue and yet the city endures." Lucius laughed. "Endures? She rules, Marcus. She bends the world to her will. And as long as the Senate speaks, Rome will never fall. Marcus smiled faintly but said nothing. He remembered the gladiator spared the previous afternoon, the trembling line between life and death. Rome seemed eternal, yet he sensed the fragility hidden beneath the marble. Still, he walked home with new respect for the men whose voices echoed within the Curia, shaping the empire as surely as generals on the battlefield. That evening, as he sat with Livia and the children, he told them of what he had seen. Of senators clashing with words like swords, of decisions made that would ripple outward to the frontiers of the world. Quintus listened intently, his eyes shining, while Julia quietly traced letters on the table, as though trying to catch the shape of the world in her small hands. Livia, as always, listened in silence, her face calm but her thoughts deep. Outside, the city settled into night, torches flickering along the streets, the murmur of taverns carrying through the air. Rome endured as it had for centuries, its heartbeat echoing in the Senate, in the Forum, in the hum of daily life. For Marcus, the day had revealed a new layer of the city's grandeur, a reminder that behind every amphora sold, every loaf of bread baked, every lesson recited, there stood the voices of men in marble halls, speaking the empire into being. The mist clung to the river like a shroud. Dawn had barely broken when Gaius Valerius Crispus rose from his straw pallet inside the wooden barracks of the legionary fortress at Mogontiacum, a Roman outpost on the Rhine frontier. The chill seeped into his bones even through his woolen cloak, sharper than anything he had felt in Italy. Germania was a land of forests and fog, of shadows that stretched endlessly beneath towering trees, of rivers that ran dark and swift. It was the edge of the known world, and for 10 years it had been his home. Around him, the other legionaries stirred awake, groaning and muttering as they pulled on tunics, fastened leather belts, and strapped hobnailed sandals to calloused feet. The barracks smelled of sweat, damp wool, and smoke from the fire that had burned low during the night. A centurion's voice cut through the haze, barking orders with the sharpness of a whip. Discipline was the lifeblood of the legions, and even in the half-light of morning, no man dared move too slowly. By the time the sun had crested the horizon, the men stood in formation outside the barracks, their shields stacked neatly, their pila, heavy-throwing spears, resting at their sides. The fortress loomed behind them, stout timber walls reinforced with stone, watchtowers at each corner, a gate flanked by guards who peered warily into the misty forest beyond. Smoke rose from the smithy and the bakeries, mingling with the smell of wet earth. Beyond the walls stretched the frontier, a world untamed, filled with tribes who both traded with and raided against Rome. Crispus had once been a farmer's son in Latium, his hands used to plowing fields, not gripping spears. He had joined the legions in search of steady pay, adventure, and perhaps the promise of land upon retirement. 10 years later, he had seen enough blood and mud to dull the shine of youthful ambition, but he had also learned the pride of standing with his brothers, of being part of the machine that made Rome feared across the world. The day's drill began. Under the stern gaze of their centurions, the legionaries marched across the training ground, their armor clinking in unison, shields raised, pila hurled with deadly accuracy into wooden targets. They drilled in formation, practicing the testudo, the tortoise, that turned men into a wall of shields, impervious to arrows. Sweat poured from their faces despite the chill, their breaths steaming in the air. Every movement was repetition, drilled endlessly until it became instinct. In battle, instinct meant survival. After hours of training, the men were given tasks. Some went to repair the palisade, others to cut timber, still others to dig ditches outside the fortress walls. Crispus was assigned to patrol duty along the riverbank. He and a small squad trudged through the mud, their armor heavy, eyes scanning the tree line for movement. The forest loomed on the opposite bank, silent yet menacing. Somewhere within it, Germanic warriors might be watching, waiting for the moment to strike. Crispus had fought them before, tall men with wild hair and painted bodies, fearless and ferocious. Rome's discipline and steel had held the line, but the memory of their war cries still haunted his dreams. At midday the squad returned to the fortress. The soldiers gathered in the barracks for their meal. Coarse bread, porridge made from barley, a piece of salted pork and watered wine. It was plain fare but it filled their stomachs. Conversation buzzed among the men, rumors of an impending campaign, complaints about the cold, jokes to lighten the monotony. Crispus listened quietly, his thoughts drifting to the family he had not seen in years. His parents were likely old now. His younger brother would have taken over the farm. Perhaps one day when his service ended, he would return home with the small pension Rome promised, enough to buy land and start anew. Yet a part of him wondered if he would ever leave the frontier. The afternoon brought work on the construction of a new watchtower overlooking the river. Soldiers hoisted timbers, hammered nails, and dug foundations, their muscles straining with the effort. Rome's empire was built not only with swords but with labor. Every fortress, road, and bridge bore the sweat of legionaries. To Crispus, it was as much a part of their duty as fighting, a constant reminder that Rome's reach extended not only through conquest but through the infrastructure that bound her provinces together. As evening fell, the men were allowed a few hours of leisure. Some gambled with dice, shouting curses and laughter as coins changed hands. Others wrote letters, scratching words onto thin wax tablets that would travel by courier back to Italy or Gaul. A few sought solace in the arms of camp followers, women who lived on the edge of the fortress, selling companionship for a price. Crispus preferred the quiet of the ramparts. He stood watch as the sun dipped behind the forest, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The river glowed like molten bronze, and for a moment, the harshness of the frontier seemed almost beautiful. Yet beauty on the frontier was fleeting. Just as night settled, the alarm was raised. A horn blared, sharp and urgent, cutting through the chatter of the camp. Men scrambled for weapons, centurions shouted commands, and the gates bristled with soldiers. Scouts had spotted movement in the forest, a band of Germanic raiders testing the defenses. Crispus's heart quickened as he tightened the straps of his helmet and lifted his shield. The drills of the morning vanished into instinct. The raiders emerged from the trees, their war cries piercing the night. Torches flared, casting wild shadows as they rushed the riverbank. Arrows whistled through the air, clattering against Roman shields. Crispus stood shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, the testudo forming as shields overlapped, a living wall of wood and iron. The raiders hurled spears, some striking the shields with bone-rattling force, others clattering harmlessly into the mud. Then the Romans surged forward, pila flying in deadly arcs. Crispus's spear struck a warrior in the chest, sending him sprawling. The clash was brief but fierce. The discipline of the legions proved too much for the wild fury of the raiders. Within moments, the survivors fled back into the forest, dragging their wounded with them. The Romans held the line, panting, bloodied but unbroken. Crispus lowered his shield, his ears still ringing with the echoes of battle. Another raid repelled, another night survived on the edge of the empire. When the camp settled once more, torches flickered along the walls, casting long shadows. Crispus sat on the rampart, staring into the dark forest. Somewhere beyond those trees, entire tribes lived. Men, women, and children whose lives were bound up in endless resistance to Rome's advance. He wondered what they thought of him, of the fortress, of the empire that pressed so relentlessly against their world. To him they were enemies, yet also men with families, dreams, fears not unlike his own. The thought lingered, unsettling as he tried to sleep. That night, as the cold seeped back into the barracks, Crispus lay awake listening to the snores of his comrades. He thought of home, of the farm, of a quiet life under the Italian sun. Yet he also knew that when dawn came he would rise again, drill again, stand the line again. For he was a legionary, a cog in the great machine of Rome, and the empire endured because men like him held the frontier against the dark. The morning broke with a brilliance that seemed touched by the gods themselves. Rome was alive with anticipation, for today marked the festival of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Lord of the skies and protector of the empire. From the earliest hours, the city stirred with motion. Priests in gleaming white robes processed toward the temples, trumpeters rehearsed their brassy notes, and vendors set up stalls laden with garlands, incense, and small figurines of the gods. Marcus Flavius Severus rose before dawn, dressing carefully in his best tunic, the one Livia had woven for him years before. Livia herself was already bustling about the household, ensuring Quintus and Julia were presentable. She tied ribbons into Julia's hair, adjusted Quintus's clean tunic, and scolded both when they fidgeted. The air in their small apartment was thick with excitement, for though the family attended rituals often, today's festival was grander than most, an occasion when Rome itself seemed to pause and lift its eyes to the heavens. By the time they stepped onto the street, the city was transformed. Everywhere, doorways were adorned with wreaths of laurel and ivy. Smoke curled upward from household altars as families made their private offerings before joining the throngs heading toward the Capitoline Hill. The murmur of voices, the clatter of sandals on stone, the bray of trumpets, it all rose into a chorus that echoed through the narrow streets. The Capitoline Hill was the heart of Rome's religious life, crowned by the great temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Its white marble gleamed in the sun, its steps crowded with worshippers, magistrates, and priests. Statues of gods and heroes lined the way, draped with fresh flowers. The scent of burning incense and roasting meat filled the air, mingling with the perfume of blossoms carried by women in their hair. For Julia, the sight was dazzling. She clutched her mother's hand tightly, her eyes wide as she tried to take it all in. At the foot of the temple, the crowd gathered to watch the procession. Priests of Jupiter emerged, their heads veiled, leading sacrificial animals adorned with gilded horns and bright ribbons. The lowing of oxen, the bleating of sheep, and the cooing of doves mixed with the solemn chant of the priests. Behind them came magistrates in their ceremonial togas, their lictors bearing the fasces as symbols of authority. Children threw handfuls of flowers, slaves carried trays of offerings, and musicians played flutes and cymbals in a rhythm that seemed to draw the crowd's heartbeats into unison. Marcus held Quintus by the shoulder, whispering explanations as each part of the procession passed. "See the oxen? They are for Jupiter himself, Lord of the skies. And those sheep are for Juno, Queen of the gods. Remember, my son, Rome's greatness depends not only on our soldiers and senators, but on our devotion to the gods who guard us." Quintus nodded earnestly, though his eyes were more fixed on the soldiers in shining breastplates who marched alongside the priests, their armor flashing in the sunlight. When the procession reached the temple steps, the crowd hushed. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, raised his arms to the sky and intoned a prayer in a voice that carried across the hill. He invoked Jupiter's favor for the empire, for the emperor, for the senate, and for the people of Rome. He asked for good harvests, for victory in war, for peace within the city's walls. As his words rolled like thunder, the oxen were led forward and laid upon the altar. The priests lifted knives of gleaming bronze, and with swift strokes the sacrifices were made. Blood poured into golden basins, the steam rising as it touched the hot stone. The crowd erupted in cries of devotion, hands lifted, voices chanting, "Jupiter! Juno! Minerva!" Julia clung to Livia, her face pale at the sight of blood, while Quintus stared with wide-eyed fascination. For Marcus, the moment stirred something deeper. He had seen the Senate debate policy, had seen gladiators shed blood for sport, but here was a different kind of offering, blood given not for men but for the gods. It was a reminder that Rome's power was bound to heaven, that every victory and every law rested on divine favor. Once the sacrifices were complete, the priests burned the entrails on the altar, reading the patterns of smoke and flame for omens. The augurs, priests skilled in divination, raised their staffs and studied the flight of birds overhead. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the verdict. At last, the augurs declared that the omens were favorable. Jupiter smiled upon Rome. Relief swept through the multitude, and a cheer rose so loud it seemed to shake the very stones of the temple. The festival then turned from solemnity to celebration. Musicians struck lively tunes, dancers whirled through the square, and vendors sold food and drink to the jubilant crowd. Marcus bought honey cakes for Julia and roasted chestnuts for Quintus, while he and Livia shared a cup of spiced wine. The children laughed as they watched jugglers toss flaming torches, acrobats tumble through the air, and storytellers recite tales of Jupiter hurling thunderbolts or Minerva springing from the head of Jupiter in full armor. As the sun climbed higher, games were held in honor of the gods. Boys raced chariots drawn by goats, their laughter ringing out as the little carts careened wildly across the square. Athletes wrestled, their bodies glistening with sweat, while the crowd shouted encouragement. Musicians competed for prizes, flutes trilling, lyres strumming, their notes weaving into a tapestry of sound. Julia clapped her hands in delight at the dancers, while Quintus declared that he would one day compete in the races, his chest swelling with boyish pride. By afternoon, the festival had spread across the city. Taverns overflowed, streets echoed with song, and strangers embraced as though bound together by the gods themselves. Even the poorest slaves found joy, given bread and wine by their masters in honor of the day. Rome seemed, for a few precious hours, united, not by law, not by conquest, but by faith and festivity. As evening approached, torches were lit along the Capitoline Hill, their flames flickering against the darkening sky. Families lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of celebration. Marcus and Livia gathered their children, weaving through the crowd with smiles softening their tired faces. They paused one last time before the temple, where the smoke of the sacrifices still curled upward, carrying Rome's prayers to the heavens. "Remember this day," Marcus said quietly to Quintus and Julia. "Rome stands because the gods stand with her. Never forget to honor them, for they guard not only the empire but our home as well." Quintus nodded solemnly, though his mind still danced with the images of music and games. Julia clutched her mother's hand, her thoughts a tangle of awe and unease. Livia, watching them both, felt the weight of Marcus's words. She knew that faith bound Rome together as tightly as laws and legions, and she hoped her children would carry that truth into their futures. As the family walked home, the city shimmered in the torchlight, alive with song and laughter. The festival had ended, but its spirit lingered in the air like incense, a reminder that Rome's greatness was not merely in her might, but in the devotion of her people to the gods above. The day after the festival, Rome stirred once more with its usual rhythm. The smoke of sacrifices had faded from the Capitoline Hill, songs and laughter had drifted away with the night, and the city returned to its business, the business of survival, of trade, of daily toil. For Marcus Flavius Severus, that meant the markets. He had promised Livia that he would take her and the children to the Forum Boarium to purchase supplies, a rare family outing that blended necessity with a taste of Rome's bustling life. The morning sun warmed the streets as they walked together. Julia skipped beside her mother, her ribbons fluttering, while Quintus walked proudly at his father's side, carrying a small basket as though it were a soldier's shield. The streets were crowded with carts rumbling over cobblestones, slaves balancing jars on their shoulders, beggars crying for alms, and officials striding with scrolls in hand. Rome never slept, and in the markets its pulse beat strongest. The Forum Boarium lay near the Tiber, close to the great Circus Maximus. It was one of the oldest markets in the city, a place where cattle had been traded since the dawn of Rome. Now it sprawled like a living labyrinth, its stalls overflowing with goods from every corner of the empire. The air was thick with smells: roasting meat, fresh fish, exotic spices, pungent garlic, and the ever-present tang of the river. Vendors shouted to advertise their wares, their voices overlapping in a cacophony that filled the square. "Fine olives from Hispania. Fresh figs from Campania," cried one man, holding up baskets overflowing with fruit. "Spices from the east, cinnamon, pepper, saffron," called another, his accent thick with the cadence of Syria. A fishmonger waved a fat eel above his head, boasting of its freshness, while a butcher displayed cuts of pork, their pink flesh glistening. Julia wrinkled her nose at the sight of hanging carcasses, but her eyes lit up when she spotted a stall filled with clay dolls and carved wooden animals. She tugged at Livia's sleeve, whispering her desire, though she dared not speak too loudly. Quintus, meanwhile, was drawn to a stand where a craftsman hammered bronze into small figurines of gladiators and gods. His eyes sparkled as he imagined himself in miniature, a tiny warrior forever captured in bronze. Marcus greeted familiar merchants, exchanging handshakes and pleasantries. He purchased a sack of grain, a jar of oil, and several amphorae of wine, haggling with the skill of a man who knew every trick of the trade. Livia selected vegetables with a careful eye, rejecting wilted leaves and bruised fruit, her fingers moving with the precision of a woman who knew how to stretch every denarius. As they shopped, Marcus pointed out the diversity of the crowd to his children. "See that man Quintus? He is from Egypt. You can tell by his tunic and the way he ties his belt. And that woman there, she is Greek. Hear how her words flow like music? Rome is not only ours, my children. It is the world brought together here in these streets. Every fish, every fig, every spice tells a story of faraway lands." The children listened with wide eyes. Julia clutched her mother's hand tighter, imagining deserts and pyramids, while Quintus puffed out his chest, imagining ships sailing under his command to bring back treasures from across the sea. For Marcus, the markets were not only a place of trade but of education, a living lesson in the vastness of the empire. At the edge of the square they passed a money changer's stall, where men crowded to exchange foreign coins for Roman denarii. The clink of silver and gold filled the air, along with muttered curses and shouted bargains. Beside it, a group of slaves stood chained together, their eyes downcast, their bodies on display for potential buyers. Julia turned her face away, unsettled by their silence, while Quintus stared, conflicted between pity and the fascination of seeing people treated as goods. Livia gently steered them onward, her lips pressed tightly together. Near the Tiber, Marcus stopped to greet a fellow merchant, an older man named Sextus, who specialized in importing papyrus and linen from Alexandria. They spoke of trade routes, of ships delayed by storms, of the rising cost of transport through the port of Ostia. Their words were dry and practical, but Marcus's children listened intently, sensing in their father's tone the seriousness of matters that shaped the bread on their table. When their purchases were complete, Marcus treated the family to a meal from one of the food stalls. They sat on a low bench, sharing roasted lamb seasoned with herbs, warm bread, and cups of watered wine. Around them, musicians played flutes and lyres, dancers twirled with ribbons, and jugglers tossed knives high into the air. The markets were not only a place of business but of entertainment, a theater where the city itself performed its vitality. After the meal, Marcus allowed each child a small indulgence. Julia received a clay doll painted in bright colors, which she hugged to her chest as though it were alive. Quintus chose a bronze figurine of a gladiator, which he held aloft like a trophy. Their laughter as they showed each other their treasures softened Livia's usual sternness. Even she smiled, her eyes warm with pride. As they prepared to leave, the sound of shouting drew their attention. A crowd had gathered near the center of the square, where two men argued fiercely over a debt. Their voices rose, their gestures wild, until one lunged at the other. In an instant, soldiers appeared, their armor gleaming, their short swords drawn. The crowd fell back in silence as the men were seized and dragged away. Rome was a city of law, but also of temper. Disputes flared as easily as torches, and the hand of order was never far behind. Walking home with baskets heavy and hearts light, Marcus reflected on the day. The markets were more than commerce. They were Rome itself in miniature, a place where the empire's vastness touched the lives of ordinary citizens. In every spice jar, in every amphora of wine, in every face from a distant land the empire breathed. And in his children's laughter, he saw the future of Rome. Young eyes opened wide to the world, eager to claim their place within it. That night, as Livia prepared their evening meal from the goods they had bought, Julia cradled her doll and Quintus staged mock battles with his bronze gladiator. Marcus sat back, weary but content, listening to their play. The city outside bustled on, its noise a constant hum, but within their modest home there was warmth and peace. The markets had given them not only food but memories, threads woven into the fabric of their lives. Rome endured because it was fed, by grain, by trade, by the endless flow of goods from every corner of the empire. Yet Rome also endured because families like his lived, loved, and dreamed within its walls. For Marcus, that was the true wealth of the city, not the silver in the money changer's stall, nor the spices from the east, but the laughter of his children and the quiet strength of his wife, steady as the Tiber itself. The insula in which Marcus Flavius Severus lived with his family was typical of Rome's swelling neighborhoods, tall, narrow, and crowded, its brick walls patched and weathered, its stairways worn by countless feet. Like most such structures, it rose 4 stories high, its lower levels occupied by shops and taverns, its upper floors crammed with apartments that ranged from modest to squalid. The Flavii dwelled on the 3rd floor, a space that was neither the best nor the worst, high enough to be away from the street's chaos, but not so high that climbing the stairs felt like scaling a mountain each evening. The stairway was narrow, dimly lit, and smelled perpetually of smoke and damp straw. Julia often complained that she could not see her feet on the steps, while Quintus dashed ahead with the reckless energy of youth. Livia always clutched her basket firmly, scolding both children to keep close, mindful of the loose bricks and the danger of stumbling in the gloom. The walls bore graffiti, political slogans, names of gladiators, crude jokes scratched by idle hands. For Marcus, these scrawls were the voice of the city itself, rough and unpolished, but alive with energy. Their apartment consisted of 2 small rooms with plastered walls and a floor of packed tiles. The front room served as kitchen, dining space, and living area, its hearth a simple brick structure where Livia prepared meals. The back room was their sleeping space, crowded with mats, blankets, and a small wooden chest where Livia stored their few valuables. The air carried the faint tang of smoke and oil, though Livia kept the place clean with daily sweeping and incense sticks bought cheaply from the market. Life in the insula was a constant negotiation with neighbors. Directly below them lived an elderly widow, Octavia, who sold bread from a stall on the street. She often complained about the noise of Julia's play or Quintus's stamping feet, but she was also quick to lend flour or oil when Livia ran short. Above them, a family of cloth dyers worked late into the night, their vats releasing pungent fumes that seeped downward. Marcus tolerated the smell, reminding himself that every trade fed Rome, though Livia often muttered about headaches and ruined laundry. The courtyard at the building's base was a world in itself. Children played games with knucklebones, their shouts echoing against the brick. Women gathered at the communal fountain, filling jars with water and exchanging gossip. Men argued politics in loud voices, invoking the names of senators and generals as though their words carried weight in the Senate. Slaves moved quietly among them, running errands for their masters, their presence so common that few paid them any notice. Every evening, Marcus would descend with Quintus to fetch water from the fountain. The line was long and tempers often flared as men jostled for place. Yet it was also where news traveled fastest. Rumors of battles on the frontier, whispers of grain shortages, tales of gladiators who had triumphed or died in the arena. Marcus listened with the ear of a merchant, sifting truth from exaggeration, storing away tidbits that might affect his trade. Quintus, meanwhile, drank in every story with wide-eyed excitement, imagining himself one day as a soldier on distant frontiers or a hero cheered by the crowds. The greatest fear of all who lived in the insula was fire. The buildings, often hastily constructed of wood and cheap brick, were tinderboxes waiting to ignite. Cooking fires, oil lamps, and crowded rooms made accidents all too common. Livia was meticulous about tending the hearth, never leaving it unattended, but she could not control her neighbors. More than once, Marcus had been awakened in the night by the frantic ringing of bells and the shouts of, "Ignis! Ignis! Fire!" On such occasions, the family would rush into the street, joining a tide of panicked tenants. Buckets of water were passed hand to hand, while the vigiles, Rome's watchmen, struggled to contain the blaze. Each time, Marcus returned to his home with gratitude that their building still stood, though he knew it was only a matter of fortune. Despite the dangers, there was also community. Julia played daily with the children of the insula, inventing games with stones, sticks, and scraps. Livia found companionship with other women at the fountain, where conversations ranged from recipes to childbirth to whispered complaints about husbands. Marcus joined his neighbors in evening discussions, debating prices of grain, victories of generals, or the character of the emperor himself. Though crowded and noisy, the insula was not merely walls and stairways, it was a living organism, its heartbeat the laughter, arguments, and struggles of those within. One evening, after a long day at the markets, Marcus returned to find the building alive with commotion. A traveling storyteller had arrived, offering tales in exchange for coins or scraps of food. Neighbors gathered in the courtyard, children perched on ledges, women leaning from windows, men standing shoulder to shoulder. The storyteller, a wiry Greek with animated gestures, spoke of Odysseus braving the sea, of Hercules slaying monsters, of Alexander conquering the world. His words wove magic in the smoky air, carrying the listeners far from their cramped quarters. Julia leaned against Livia, eyes wide with wonder, while Quintus clenched his fists in excitement, declaring he too would one day be a hero. When the tale ended, coins clinked into the storyteller's basket, and bread was pressed into his hand. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, laughter and chatter lingering. As Marcus led his family upstairs, he felt a rare warmth. In that moment, the insula was not a place of hardship but of shared humanity, where stories and dreams rose above cracked plaster and smoke-stained walls. Night in the insula brought its own rhythm. The sounds of the city softened, replaced by murmurs through thin walls, the cry of a baby, the shuffle of feet on stairs, the occasional bark of a dog. Livia lit a small oil lamp, its flame flickering against the plaster, and laid out mats for the children. Julia clutched her clay doll, Quintus his bronze gladiator, each falling asleep to the muffled lullaby of the city. Marcus stretched his weary limbs, listening to the quiet hum of life around him, and felt both the fragility and the strength of their existence. Rome was grand, its temples, forums, and amphitheaters dazzling with marble and gold. Yet Rome was also here, in the narrow stairways, in the smoky rooms, in the laughter of children and the quarrels of neighbors. The empire might be ruled from palaces and senates, but its lifeblood flowed through the insulae, where millions lived, worked, dreamed, and endured. For Marcus and his family, the insula was both burden and blessing. It was a place of danger, of noise, of cramped space. Yet it was also home, a small corner of the greatest city in the world, where love and struggle coexisted within thin walls. And as Marcus drifted into sleep beside his wife, he knew that while emperors rose and fell, Rome would endure, because families like his endured within the insula's fragile embrace. The morning sun had barely risen above the rooftops when Marcus roused Quintus from his sleep. "Up, my son," he said firmly. "The world belongs to those who rise early and learn its ways." Quintus groaned, rubbing sleep from his eyes, but he obeyed, for today he was to join his companions at the Ludus, the small neighborhood school where Roman boys learned the foundations of knowledge and citizenship. Livia prepared a simple breakfast of bread dipped in watered wine, setting aside a handful of dried figs for the children's midday snack. Julia, ever curious, dressed quickly and announced she would accompany her brother, though she knew the lessons were not meant for girls. Livia smiled faintly, neither encouraging nor forbidding her. Julia's sharp mind was her own pride, though Rome did not always reward such gifts in daughters. The streets were already filling with life as Marcus led his children toward the school. Merchants opened their shops, bakers sold hot loaves from their ovens, and slaves swept the sidewalks clean. The clatter of carts mingled with the cries of vendors. Quintus carried his wax tablet and stylus, tucked under his arm like a soldier's weapon, while Julia skipped beside him, her doll hidden in her cloak. The ludus was held in a shaded corner of a portico, a simple space where children gathered under the watchful eye of their magister. There were no grand halls or marble benches, only stools, mats, and the steady voice of the teacher. The magister, Lucius Cornelius, was a stern man of middle age, his beard trimmed, his toga worn but clean. His eyes, sharp as daggers, scanned his pupils as Marcus bowed in greeting and left his son in his care. "Sit, boys," the magister commanded, rapping his staff against the stone. The pupils arranged themselves in a semicircle, their tablets resting on their knees. Julia slipped quietly to the side, pretending to watch without intruding, though she quickly drew the magister's eye. "Ah, a girl," he remarked with faint disapproval. "No matter. She may listen if she keeps silent." Julia bit her lip but nodded eagerly. The lesson began with letters. The boys traced the shapes of Latin characters into their wax tablets, repeating them aloud in rhythmic chorus. A, B, C, D, their voices rose and fell, the sound echoing off the stone walls. The magister corrected errors with sharp words, striking the air with his staff to punctuate his point. When one boy's writing faltered, he tapped the boy's knuckles with the flat of his stylus, not cruelly but with the authority of discipline. From letters they moved to reading. A scroll of Virgil's Aeneid was unrolled, and the boys took turns reciting passages, their young voices stumbling over the weight of epic verse. Quintus flushed with pride when his turn came, speaking the lines as best he could, though his Latin wavered. Julia whispered the words softly to herself, her lips moving with the cadence of the poem. Livia had taught her to read at home, though it was a skill not expected of most Roman girls. Her secret delight was to share the same stories as her brother, even if only from the margins. The magister's voice filled the air with commentary. He explained the glory of Aeneas, the piety of Rome's founding hero, the lessons of courage and duty every Roman must learn. "Remember, boys," he said, raising a finger, "a Roman is not merely a man, he is a servant of the residential publica. Learn your letters, learn your history, and you will be worthy of the toga virilis." The boys nodded solemnly, though some stifled yawns. Quintus sat straighter, his chest swelling at the thought of one day wearing the white toga of manhood. Arithmetic followed. Pebbles were spread on the ground, and the children worked sums by arranging them into patterns. 2 plus 3 5, 5 times 2 10, the voices chanted, rising and falling like soldiers' marching feet. Quintus, quick with numbers, enjoyed the exercise, while Julia frowned in concentration, her fingers moving swiftly to match her brother's. When she whispered the answer before him, Quintus shot her a look of irritation, though he secretly admired her speed. By midday the sun burned hot, and the magister dismissed his pupils for a brief rest. The children gathered in small groups, eating their figs and bread, gossiping about gladiators and chariot races. Julia sat with Quintus, sharing her doll as though it too were a pupil. The boys teased her lightly, but Julia gave as good as she got, answering their jests with quick words that left them laughing. Even the magister, overhearing, allowed himself the faintest of smiles. When lessons resumed, the subject turned to rhetoric, the art of speaking. Each boy was asked to stand and argue a simple case, pretending to plead before a magistrate. One argued why his father's mule should not be taxed, another why a stolen loaf of bread deserved leniency. Quintus spoke passionately of why gladiators should be honored more than actors, gesturing with his small hands as though addressing the Senate itself. The magister praised his enthusiasm, though he corrected his grammar with pointed precision. Julia could not contain herself. When a boy faltered in his argument, she rose impulsively, offering her own defense, that mercy was as noble as justice, and that the gods favored those who forgave. The courtyard fell silent. For a moment the magister frowned, prepared to scold, but then he nodded slowly. "Well-spoken girl," he admitted, surprising even himself. "Perhaps you were born for more than silence." Julia's cheeks burned with pride, while Quintus stared at her with a mix of admiration and sibling rivalry. The afternoon wore on, and the lessons grew slower as the children grew weary. The magister ended with a prayer to Minerva, goddess of wisdom, urging his pupils to honor her with diligence and humility. "Knowledge," he declared, "is the foundation of Rome's greatness. Without it, swords are but sticks and laws but empty words." As the children filed out, Marcus waited at the gate, his broad figure a welcome sight. He listened as Quintus proudly recounted his recitation of Virgil, while Julia eagerly told her version of the debate. Marcus chuckled, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "Good," he said warmly. "Learn all you can. Rome does not thrive on strength alone. It thrives on minds that think, on tongues that persuade, on hearts that remember who we are." They walked home together, the sun casting long shadows across the city. Julia clutched her doll, her thoughts filled with dreams of speeches and stories, while Quintus rehearsed lines of Virgil under his breath, determined to recite them perfectly next time. For Marcus and Livia, watching their children grow was both joy and burden. They knew the path of life would not be easy, but they also knew Rome's future lived in the hearts of its young. That night, as the oil lamp flickered low, Marcus thought of the lessons his children carried. Letters, numbers, history, rhetoric, all tools of empire. He wondered what they would become. A soldier, a senator, perhaps a merchant like himself. And though he could not know the answer, he took comfort in the sound of their voices, repeating the lines of Virgil softly in the dark, "Arma verum cano, of arms and the man I sing." The heat of midday pressed upon the city, and Marcus Flavius Severus declared it was time for the baths. "Come, Quintus," he said, clapping his son on the shoulder. "You must learn to bathe like a Roman. And you, Julia, will come with your mother. A separate space awaits the women, but the waters are for all." Julia clapped her hands with delight, while Quintus grinned, puffing with pride at being included in a ritual he had so long observed from afar. They set out together, carrying small bundles wrapped in cloth. Inside were their strigils, curved metal tools used to scrape the skin, their little flasks of oil and linen towels. The streets buzzed with life as always, but near the baths the crowd thickened. Men and women, slaves and freedmen, senators and beggars, all flowed toward the great gates, for the Thermae were among Rome's greatest gifts to its people. The baths they visited that day were not the grandest in Rome, such as those built by Agrippa or later emperors, but even so they dazzled the eye. Massive stone arches rose above the entrance, decorated with statues of Apollo and Neptune. The walls gleamed with marble facing, their colors catching the sun. A steady stream of bathers entered and exited, some laughing, others quiet and contemplative, all bound together by the shared ritual of cleansing body and spirit. Inside, the noise of the city faded, replaced by the hum of voices, the splash of water, and the echo of footsteps on marble floors. Slaves hurried to and fro, carrying baskets, tending fires, and assisting their masters. The first chamber they entered was the apoditerium, the changing room, lined with niches where bathers stored their belongings. Slaves stood ready to guard the clothes, though theft was never far from mind. Marcus kept a watchful eye as he undressed, handing his tunic and sandals to an attendant. Quintus hesitated, embarrassed to shed his clothes among so many strangers, but Marcus spoke firmly. "A Roman has no shame in the baths, my son. Here all are equal, stripped of wealth and rank." Julia, meanwhile, followed Livia into the women's section, glancing back once at her brother with a mischievous smile. From the apoditerium, Marcus and Quintus moved into the tepidarium, a warm room meant to accustom the body to heat. The air was thick with moisture, the walls lined with polished marble, mosaics depicting dolphins and sea nymphs shimmering in the light. Quintus touched the tiles, marveling at their warmth, for beneath the floor roared the hypocaust, the great furnace system that heated the baths. The soft murmur of conversation filled the room as men reclined on benches, oiling their skin in preparation for the hotter chambers. "See, Quintus," Marcus explained, "this warmth loosens the muscles and clears the mind. We linger here before entering the caldarium." Soon they passed into the caldarium, the hot bath. Steam billowed like mist on a battlefield, and the air clung heavy to the skin. At the far end, a great pool shimmered, its surface broken by ripples as men waded and sank into its depths. Slaves poured water over their masters, strigils scraped sweat and oil from glistening backs, and the scent of perfumed oils mingled with the sharp tang of heated stone. Quintus gasped, overwhelmed by the heat, but Marcus guided him forward. "Breathe deeply, my son. The caldarium purges the body. Here a Roman sweats out weakness." Together they sank into the water, the heat enveloping them. Quintus clenched his jaw at first, but soon he relaxed, his face breaking into a smile. Around them, conversations rose, discussions of Senate debates, of gladiator matches, of business deals struck in whispers between splashes. After a time, Marcus led his son onward to the frigidarium, the cold bath. Here the water was icy, drawn fresh from aqueducts, its shock a bracing jolt after the caldarium's heat. Quintus yelped as he plunged in, his teeth chattering, while Marcus laughed heartily. This is the Roman way, to temper fire with ice, strength with discipline. The frigidarium echoed with shouts and laughter as men leapt into the water, their bodies gleaming in the torchlight. Meanwhile, in the women's section, Julia clung to Livia's hand as they moved through similar chambers. Julia marveled at the mosaics on the walls, scenes of Venus rising from the sea, dolphins leaping through waves, nymphs dancing with ribbons. The women's baths were quieter, filled with conversation about families, recipes, and the price of grain. Julia giggled as Livia used a strigil to scrape her arms, the metal tool tickling her skin. For Julia, the baths were less about ritual and more about wonder, the sight of so many women together, laughing, talking, and relaxing as though the weight of the city had been set aside. After bathing, the family reunited in the courtyard outside the baths, their skin glistening, their bodies refreshed. Vendors stood ready with trays of food and drink, dates, honey cakes, and cool water flavored with herbs. Marcus purchased figs for Julia and a sweet cake for Quintus, while he and Livia shared a cup of diluted wine. Around them, the courtyard buzzed with life. Philosophers debated loudly under shaded porticos, athletes wrestled in the palestra, and poets recited verses to small audiences who listened with rapt attention. Quintus watched a pair of men sparring in the palestra, their muscles taut, their movements swift. "Father," he whispered eagerly, "may I try?" Marcus laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "One day perhaps. For now, learn to master your mind before your fists." Julia, meanwhile, tugged at Livia's hand, eager to watch a juggler tossing knives, her eyes wide with delight. As the sun dipped lower, the family made their way home, their limbs loose, their spirits lifted. Marcus felt the weight of his daily burdens eased by the ritual of the baths. The Thermae were more than stone and water, they were Rome's answer to the needs of body and soul. Here, citizens found equality in nakedness, strength in discipline, and community in conversation. The baths were where deals were struck, friendships forged, and minds refreshed for the duties of empire. That evening, as Livia prepared supper, Julia recounted the mosaics she had seen, describing Venus's flowing hair and the dolphins' leaping grace. Quintus boasted of his endurance in the caldarium and his bravery in plunging into the frigidarium. Marcus listened with satisfaction, knowing that his children had tasted something essential to Roman life. As night fell, the glow of the oil lamps softened their small room. The voices of neighbors drifted through thin walls, mingling with the distant hum of the city. Marcus closed his eyes, his body still tingling with warmth from the baths, and whispered to himself, "Rome is strong because her people are strong. And her people are strong because we share in her gifts." In the heart of the empire, marble walls and steaming waters reminded every citizen, from senator to freedman, that Rome was not only power and conquest, but also community, health, and the daily rhythm of life lived together. The morning sky blazed with a brilliance that promised heat, but in Rome the people cared little. Today was a day of spectacle. Trumpets had sounded at dawn, echoing across the city to announce the games, and already the streets surged with excitement. Citizens poured toward the great Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater, its colossal arches gleaming like ivory in the sun. It was said the structure could hold 50,000 souls, and by the end of the day, every seat would be filled. Marcus Flavius Severus rose early, his household abuzz with anticipation. He had managed, through a client's favor, to secure good seats for his family, no easy feat in a city where demand for such spectacles stretched from senators to slaves. Quintus could barely contain his excitement, clutching the bronze figurine of a gladiator he had bought weeks earlier at the market. Julia, more hesitant, clung to her mother's hand, both curious and apprehensive about what awaited them. Livia herself was reserved. She did not share her husband's taste for blood sport, yet she knew the games were part of Rome's soul, and thus part of her children's education. The Colosseum loomed before them as they joined the throngs flowing through its towering gates. Its sheer scale stunned Julia, its tiers rising like a mountain of stone. Carved statues adorned its arcades, banners fluttered in the breeze, and vendors shouted their wares, dates, olives, bread, and cups of watered wine for those who wished to feast as they watched death unfold. The roar of the crowd within was already a living thing, pulsing like the heart of the empire itself. Inside, the amphitheater dazzled. The seats climbed in sweeping tiers, the lowest reserved for senators and nobles, the highest for women, slaves, and the poor. Marcus guided his family to the middle ranks, where merchants and craftsmen sat, a sea of togas and tunics stretching as far as the eye could see. The arena below shimmered with golden sand, its boundaries marked by high walls and iron gates. Beneath those gates lay the hypogeum, the labyrinth of tunnels where gladiators and beasts awaited their moment in the sun. Trumpets blared, and the crowd erupted in cheers as the procession began. First came the magistrates who sponsored the games, robed in scarlet and gold, their names shouted by heralds to remind the people of their generosity. Then came musicians playing pipes and horns, their notes rising in triumphant fanfare. Finally, the gladiators emerged in a dazzling parade, Murmillos with their crested helmets and broad shields, Retiarii with nets and tridents, Secutors with smooth helmets designed to face the net fighters, and others armed with swords, spears and daggers. Their bodies gleamed with oil, their muscles taut, their faces proud, or resigned. Quintus leapt to his feet, shouting until his voice cracked, while Julia pressed against Livia, staring in awe and fear. Marcus nodded gravely, his eyes fixed on the fighters. He had seen such parades before, yet each time he felt the same mixture of admiration and unease. These men were both slaves and stars, condemned yet celebrated, living symbols of Rome's hunger for spectacle. The first contests were Venatians, hunts staged within the arena. Gates clanged open and wild beasts burst forth. Lions from Africa, bears from the forests of Germania, leopards from the east. The crowd roared as gladiators armed with spears and bows engaged the creatures. Blood sprang across the sand as man and beast clashed in brutal combat. One lion leapt at a fighter, clawing his shoulder before being skewered by a thrusting spear. Julia hid her face in Livia's cloak, trembling at the sight, while Quintus shouted encouragement as though the fighters could hear him. After the hunts came executions. Prisoners, condemned criminals, rebels and thieves, were led into the arena. Some were forced to fight unarmed against wild beasts, their screams swallowed by the crowd's cheer. Others were burned, crucified, or struck down by gladiators in choreographed displays of justice. Livia turned her children's eyes away, whispering prayers under her breath. Marcus's jaw tightened. Though he accepted Rome's harsh laws, he could not ignore the cruelty that paraded as entertainment. Yet the crowd cheered all the same, for to them, justice was spectacle and spectacle was Rome. At last came the main event, the gladiatorial duels. The crowd roared as pairs of fighters squared off, steel clashing against steel, shields splintering, sand flying beneath their feet. A Murmillo swung his heavy gladius in great arcs, his shield braced against a net fighter's thrusting trident. A Secutor charged forward, his smooth helmet glinting, pressing his foe until blood splattered the arena floor. The fighters' breaths came in grunts and shouts, their bodies gleaming with sweat and blood, their every move watched by tens of thousands of hungry eyes. Quintus shouted himself hoarse, naming favorites, leaping to his feet when one fighter seemed to gain the upper hand. Julia trembled, torn between fascination and horror, her small hands clenched tightly around her mother's. Livia whispered to her, "Remember, child, this is Rome's way. Strength and courage are honored, but so too is mercy." Indeed, when a gladiator fell, the victor raised his weapon and turned to the crowd. The audience shouted, gesturing with thumbs, down for death, up for mercy, though in truth the gestures were more complex than rumor claimed. The editor of the games, seated in splendor, gave the final signal. Sometimes a man was spared, his courage granting him another day. Other times the fatal blow was delivered, blood soaking the sand as the crowd cheered in frenzy. Quintus's eyes shone with exhilaration. Julia wept softly into her mother's shoulder. Hours passed in this cycle of blood and roar, until the sun dipped low and the final match ended in thunderous applause. The sand of the arena was stained red, the air heavy with the stench of sweat, iron and death. The gladiators who survived were led away, some limping, some proud, all marked by the day's combat. The crowd, satiated, began to file out, buzzing with talk of heroic strikes and tragic defeats. As Marcus guided his family home, he reflected on what they had witnessed. To Rome, the games were more than blood. They were symbols of power, discipline, and the order of empire. The Colosseum itself stood as proof of Rome's might, a monument of stone and spectacle, binding rich and poor alike in shared passion. Yet beneath the glory lay shadows. Lives spent for entertainment, cruelty disguised as justice, blood spilled to sustain the empire's hunger for spectacle. That evening, Quintus replayed the duels with his bronze figurine, reenacting strikes and parries with fierce enthusiasm. Julia sat quietly, her doll in her lap, her eyes clouded with unease. Livia watched them both, her heart torn between pride in her son's bravery and sorrow for her daughter's fear. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression grave. "They have seen Rome today," he said softly. "The glory and the cost. Both are truths they must carry." And so the day at the Colosseum ended, not with silence, but with echoes of trumpets and cheers lingering in the children's dreams. For Rome was never gentle, but she was magnificent, and her magnificence demanded blood. The dawn broke with the tolling of bronze bells, their tones deep and resonant, carrying across the rooftops of Rome. Already the air was heavy with the scent of burning incense and the hum of voices gathering in the streets. Today was a holy day, dedicated to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, guardian of Rome, and to the divine spirit of the emperor himself. It was not merely a festival of religion, it was a declaration of Rome's order, her unity, her power. Marcus Flavius Severus rose before the first light touched the Tiber. He dressed carefully, donning a clean tunic and the toga that marked his citizen's dignity. Livia tied her hair in a neat coil, fastening it with a bronze pin, while Julia danced with excitement, already clutching a small wreath of laurel she had woven the night before. Quintus too was restless, eager to join the throngs that would soon crowd the Forum and the great temple on the Capitoline Hill. As the family stepped into the street, they found themselves swept into a tide of humanity. Citizens of every rank, freedmen, slaves, soldiers and children, all moved together toward the heart of the city. Vendors shouted over the din, selling honey cakes, garlands of flowers and votive offerings. Musicians played flutes and horns, their melodies weaving through the chatter of the crowd. The streets shimmered with color, tunics dyed red, yellow and green, banners fluttering from balconies, petals scattered by laughing children. At the Forum, the spectacle widened into grandeur. Columns were draped with garlands, statues adorned with gold leaf, and altars smoked with offerings. Priests in white robes moved with solemn grace, their heads crowned with laurel, leading the rituals that would call down the favor of the gods. Behind them came the sacred animals, white oxen with gilded horns, their hides gleaming, led by slaves and attendants. The air vibrated with anticipation, as if Jupiter himself were descending to witness the devotion of his people. Trumpets blared and the procession began. At its head marched lictors bearing fasces, symbols of Rome's authority, followed by magistrates in scarlet-bordered togas, their faces stern with dignity. Next came the priests chanting hymns in low, steady tones, their voices mingling with the rhythm of drums. The sacred oxen followed, each step slow and deliberate, their breath steaming in the morning air. Behind them, in glittering robes, came the image of Jupiter, carried aloft on a gilded platform by slaves, his face stern and commanding, his hand raised in eternal dominion. The crowd fell to their knees as the statue passed, raising hands in prayer. Julia clutched her wreath tightly, her lips moving in silent supplication. A wish for her family's safety, her brother's courage, and perhaps, in secret, for a doll finer than the one she already owned. Quintus bowed stiffly, repeating the prayers his father had taught him, for strength, for wisdom, for honor. Marcus himself prayed with quiet fervor, not only for his household but for Rome, whose fate was the fate of them all. The procession climbed the steep slope of the Capitoline Hill, its path lined with citizens casting flowers and incense. At the summit, the great temple of Jupiter loomed, its massive columns rising like guardians of heaven. Within its shadow, the sacrifices would be made. The oxen were led forward, garlands draped across their broad necks, their hooves stamping against the stone. Priests raised their knives, their chants rising to a fevered pitch. With swift precision, the animals were struck, their blood flowing across the altar, their smoke rising in curling plumes toward the gods above. Julia turned her face away, her small hands gripping Livia's arm. Quintus stared, his jaw tight, his young mind caught between fascination and unease. Marcus stood tall, for he knew the sight was not meant to horrify but to affirm. Rome's bond with her gods was sealed in blood and flame, in ritual as old as the city itself. After the sacrifice came the prayers of the magistrates, spoken aloud for all to hear. They prayed for victory in war, for prosperity in harvest, for the emperor's health, and for the strength of Rome to endure for all eternity. The crowd responded with shouts of Ave, Ave, their voices echoing down the hill, carrying across the Forum, a chorus of faith and loyalty that bound the empire together. Then came the feasting. Tables were set in the open spaces, laden with bread, cheese, olives, and fruit. Wine flowed freely, music played, dancers whirled in bright garments, and acrobats tumbled to the delight of children. Julia at last released her wreath, tossing it onto a small shrine, then clapped with joy as a troupe of jugglers performed. Quintus wrestled with other boys in mock contests, pretending they were gladiators, though his father's stern look reminded him not to grow careless with play. Marcus moved among neighbors and clients, exchanging greetings and words of loyalty. In Rome, religion was never far from politics. The festival honored both the gods and the emperor, and to be seen participating was as important as the prayers themselves. Deals were struck over cups of wine, promises made, friendships renewed. Rome was a web of obligations, and the festival bound its threads tighter still. As the sun began to sink, the family returned home, weary but filled with the day's pageantry. Julia hummed the tune of a hymn she had heard, her laurel wreath now resting on the family's small household shrine. Quintus recited the prayers he had learned, his young voice solemn. Livia lit a lamp and placed it before the household gods, offering a pinch of incense, her heart grateful for the safety of her children. Marcus lingered by the doorway, gazing out at the city glowing in the sunset. Smoke still rose from the Capitoline, carrying prayers skyward. He thought of the power of such rituals, the way they bound Rome together, from the poorest beggar to the greatest senator, in shared faith and spectacle. Religion was not merely private devotion, it was Rome's very heartbeat, a pulse that reminded every citizen they belonged to something vast, eternal, divine. That night, as the family lay in their beds, the sounds of distant hymns still drifted through the streets. Quintus dreamed of Jupiter's stern face, Julia of laurel wreaths and dancing acrobats. Marcus closed his eyes with a silent prayer. May Rome endure as long as the gods will it. And above the city, the stars burned bright, eternal witnesses to the vows of men. The invitation arrived on a wax tablet, sealed with the signet of Gaius Aelius Varro, a wealthy patron whose favor Marcus had cultivated for years. The words were formal, but the meaning was clear. Marcus and his family were to dine at Varro's villa that evening, a mark of honor that could not be declined. In Rome, banquets were more than feasts. They were stages upon which alliances were forged, reputations polished, and power displayed. Marcus knew well the importance of appearing in Varro's company, and he prepared his household with the seriousness of a campaign. Livia dressed with careful elegance, choosing a stola of pale green that set off the dark richness of her hair. Julia, though young, was arrayed in a simple tunic, her eyes wide with excitement at the thought of entering a grand villa. Quintus polished his sandals until they gleamed, rehearsing polite phrases his father had drilled into him. Words of greeting, words of respect. Marcus himself wore his toga with precision, every fold arranged, every gesture rehearsed. In Rome, appearances spoke as loudly as words, and a poorly tied toga could undo months of careful effort. As dusk fell, they arrived at Varro's villa, its great bronze doors flanked by torches. The entrance hall glowed with lamplight, mosaics of mythic scenes beneath their feet. Hercules wrestling the lion, Orpheus charming beasts with his lyre. Slaves bowed low, guiding them toward the triclinium, the dining hall, where the evening spectacle awaited. The triclinium was a marvel of Roman taste and wealth. 3 great couches formed a U-shape around a low, polished table of marble, its surface already heavy with silver dishes and crystal cups. The walls gleamed with frescoes, Bacchus crowned with ivy, Venus rising from the sea, banquets of gods echoing the feast below. The air was heavy with the scent of roses, their petals scattered across the floor by unseen hands. Musicians strummed lyres softly in the corner, their notes weaving a spell of refinement and ease. Varro greeted his guests with the practiced warmth of a patron, his toga of pure white edged with purple proclaiming his status. Marcus Flavius Severus, he boomed, clasping Marcus's hand. Your presence honors my table. And these must be your jewels, your wife and children. Livia curtsied with dignity, Julia bowed shyly, and Quintus spoke his rehearsed words with careful clarity, earning a nod of approval from Varro. Once the greetings were done, the feast began. Guests reclined on couches, each according to rank, with Varro presiding at the place of honor. Marcus was pleased to find himself placed close enough to converse, a subtle acknowledgement of his growing influence. Livia and Julia were seated nearby among the women, who spoke in gentle tones, their laughter rising like the clink of cups. Quintus lingered near his father, watching every gesture, eager to learn the ways of Roman society. The courses arrived in splendid procession. First came eggs, olives and oysters, gleaming on silver platters. Slaves poured honeyed wine, cool and sweet, into cups of glass finer than anything Marcus owned. Then came fish seasoned with herbs from distant provinces, followed by roasted game, pheasants, hares and even a peacock, its feathers spread like a fan of jewels. The centerpiece was a great boar, its belly stuffed with sausages, steaming as it was carved before the awed guests. Julia gasped softly at the sight, while Quintus leaned forward, his eyes wide with hunger. Conversation flowed as freely as the wine. Varro spoke of politics, of the emperor's latest decrees, of rumors from the Senate. Others debated philosophy, whether Stoic discipline or Epicurean pleasure offered the truest wisdom. A poet recited verses in a rich voice, his words painting tales of love and loss, war and triumph. Musicians accompanied him, their strings trembling like sighs. The guests applauded, some with genuine admiration, others with polite pretense, for in Rome, every reaction was measured, every gesture observed. Marcus spoke carefully, offering insights when called upon, praising Varro's hospitality with eloquence that drew nods of approval. He knew the art of flattery without excess, of confidence without arrogance. Livia, too, played her role with grace, engaging the women in talk of household gods, of children's education, of fashion from the East. Even Julia found herself swept into conversation, her innocent questions earning laughter and indulgent smiles. As the evening deepened, the wine grew stronger, the talk louder. Jesters performed tricks, tumblers flipped across the floor, and trained birds sang in cages of gold. Slaves moved tirelessly, refilling cups, clearing platters, fanning guests with peacock feathers. Some guests grew flushed, their voices rising in argument or song, but Marcus kept his composure, sipping lightly, his mind alert. He watched as favors were granted, promises exchanged, alliances hinted at beneath the veil of laughter and jest. At last came the final course: sweet cakes drizzled with honey, figs stuffed with nuts, and dates from the deserts of Arabia. Wine spiced with cinnamon and cloves was poured, its aroma rich and heady. The guests leaned back, sated, their laughter softer now, their voices weaving into the low hum of contentment. Varro raised his cup in a final toast. "To Rome," he declared, his voice resonant. "To her gods, her emperor, her glory eternal." The guests echoed the words, their cups raised high, their voices blending into one triumphant chorus. The night ended in slow dispersal. Slaves helped guests to their feet, cloaks were returned, farewells exchanged. Varro clasped Marcus's hand once more, whispering words of promise. "We shall speak soon of business. Your diligence does not go unnoticed." Marcus bowed deeply, gratitude in his eyes, for he knew such words could mean advancement, wealth, perhaps even security for generations. As the family stepped into the cool night air, the city stretched before them, silent but alive. Julia clutched Livia's hand, her mind spinning with images of painted walls and golden dishes. Quintus walked close to his father, whispering questions about the philosophers, the generals, the stories he had overheard. Marcus answered patiently, his own heart alight with cautious hope. At home, as they prepared for rest, Marcus reflected on the evening. The food, the wine, the music, all were splendid, but they were more than indulgence. They were Rome's way of weaving her citizens into a net of obligation and loyalty, of binding families together under the gaze of patrons and gods alike. Banquets were not merely meals, they were the empire itself, laid out upon a table, served in courses of power and ambition. And as the oil lamps flickered low, Marcus whispered to himself, "Rome feasts, and in her feasting she rules." The first light of dawn spread across the city when Marcus Flavius Severus called his household together. "Today," he said, "we journey beyond the walls. You have seen Rome's markets, her baths, her temples, her games, but now you will see the land that feeds her." His children, still heavy with sleep, perked up at the thought of a journey. Quintus beamed at the chance to ride beside his father, while Julia clapped her hands, already imagining orchards and streams. Their destination was the villa of Lucius Cornelius Varro, a client of Marcus's patron and a man of comfortable means. Though not among the great senatorial estates that stretched for miles, Varro's villa was still grand compared to Marcus's modest insula. It lay a half-day's ride from Rome, nestled among rolling hills where vineyards and olive groves sprawled beneath the open sky. They set out at dawn, the city stirring awake around them. Carts rattled through narrow streets, carrying vegetables, wine, and amphorae toward the markets. Beggars called from doorways, soldiers marched in patrols, priests sprinkled incense on household shrines. Passing through the mighty gates of Rome, the family joined the flow of travelers along the Via Appia, the great road stretching southward in straight, unwavering lines. The countryside opened before them like a tapestry. Fields of wheat rippled in the breeze, dotted with laborers bent to their work. Shepherds guided flocks across meadows, their dogs barking at strays. Villas stood like islands of stone amid seas of green, their tiled roofs gleaming in the sun. Julia marveled at the sight of oxen yoked to plows, their steady pace carving furrows in the earth, while Quintus peppered his father with questions about crops, harvests, and markets. Marcus answered patiently, for he too respected the land, knowing it was the true foundation of Rome's wealth. By midday they arrived at Varro's villa. The estate spread across a gentle slope, its walls of pale stone surrounded by orchards heavy with fruit. A shaded portico welcomed them, its columns entwined with vines. Slaves hurried to greet their master's guests, guiding the family inside. Julia gasped at the sight of painted walls depicting scenes of rural life. Farmers reaping grain, women pressing olives, children chasing hares through fields. The air smelled of bread baking and herbs drying, the scent of the countryside itself. Varro welcomed them warmly, embracing Marcus and bowing to Livia with practiced courtesy. He was a stout man, his skin bronzed from years spent supervising his land. His wife, Flavia, received Julia and Quintus with gentle smiles, offering honey cakes as a token of hospitality. Soon the children were laughing with Flavia's own brood, racing through the villa's garden where fountains sparkled and roses bloomed. After a brief meal, Varro led Marcus and Quintus on a tour of the estate. They passed through courtyards where slaves prepared tools, sharpened blades, and mended harnesses. The storerooms smelled of grain and wine, amphorae stacked high in neat rows. Beyond lay the fields, where lines of workers bent beneath the sun, their hands deft as they cut wheat with sickles or pruned vines with knives. Overseers strode among them, their voices sharp, their eyes watchful. Quintus's face grew solemn as he watched the slaves toil. Sweat drenched their bodies, their backs bent under relentless labor. Some were Gauls, their hair still fair beneath the grime. Others were darker, brought from Africa or the East. They sang in low voices as they worked, their songs strange and haunting to Roman ears. "Father," Quintus whispered, "do they never rest?" Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "They rest when the land allows it. Their labor feeds Rome. Remember this, my son, the empire is not built only by soldiers and senators, but by the hands of those who work unseen." In the olive groves, Julia ran laughing with the other children, gathering fallen fruit in baskets too heavy for her small arms. Flavia watched with indulgence, though her eyes strayed often to the workers pressing olives nearby, their bodies slick with oil, their faces weary. For the mistress of the house, leisure and labor coexisted uneasily, separated by status yet bound together by necessity. At midday the family dined in the villa's shaded atrium. Bowls of fresh figs and olives were set beside loaves of warm bread, cheese from the villa's own goats, and wine diluted with cool spring water. Quintus ate heartily, declaring the cheese finer than any sold in the city, while Julia declared the figs the sweetest she had ever tasted. Marcus, sipping his wine, remarked upon the harmony of rural life, though he knew well the hidden harshness beneath its surface. In the afternoon Varro led them to the vineyards. Rows of vines stretched across the hillside, their green leaves shimmering in the breeze. Workers moved among them, tying shoots to stakes, checking for pests, ensuring the grapes grew plump for the coming harvest. Varro spoke proudly of his wines, destined to be sold in Rome's markets, perhaps even shipped across the sea. He gestured to the amphorae waiting to be filled, each marked with the seal of his household. "Here lies wealth, Marcus," he said with a smile. "Not in coins but in the earth, in vines that endure year after year." Quintus listened intently, his young mind grasping the lesson. Julia, less interested in vines and markets, wandered toward a small stream at the edge of the estate, dipping her toes into the cool water, watching dragonflies dart in the sun. Livia joined her, smiling as her daughter splashed, grateful for a moment of peace amid the demands of Roman life. As evening approached, the family gathered once more in the villa's atrium. Slaves lit lamps, their glow soft upon the painted walls. Musicians played gentle tunes on pipes, and the air filled with the hum of conversation. Varro spoke of harvests and markets, Marcus of city news, Flavia of household duties and children. The night unfolded not in splendor as at Varro's banquet in Rome, but in quiet dignity, the rhythm of rural life setting its own pace. When at last the family prepared to return to the city, Julia clung to Flavia's hand, reluctant to leave the gardens and fields she had come to love. Quintus begged to stay longer, eager to learn more of farming and markets. Marcus promised they would return one day, though he knew the demands of Rome might keep them within the city walls for many months. As they rode back beneath the rising moon, the countryside lay silent around them, its fields silver in the night. Marcus looked upon the land with renewed respect, knowing it was here, in the sweat of slaves and the patience of farmers, that Rome's true strength lay. The city might glitter with marble and echo with triumphs, but without the villa and the field, without grain and wine, Rome would wither. And so he whispered to himself as his children dozed in the cart, "Rome endures because the land endures." The wind cut like a knife across the northern frontier. Here, far from the marble columns of Rome, the empire's power was measured not in temples or forums, but in stone walls, wooden palisades, and the grit of men who bore their armor through rain and snow. Flavius Marcellus, a veteran centurion of the 20th Legion, pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders as he strode along the ramparts of the fort at Eboracum, in distant Britannia. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke, mingled with the iron tang of sharpened weapons. The fort was a world unto itself, a square of stone and timber carved into the wild lands of the north. Its gates stood watchful, its walls bristling with towers, its barracks echoing with the sounds of hammers, drills and shouted commands. Beyond stretched forests and moors, bleak and untamed, dotted with villages of the native Britons who bowed reluctantly to Roman rule. Here life was harsher, slower and always edged with danger. Marcellus had seen 20 campaigns, his body marked with scars from Germania to Dacia, but it was here in Britannia that he felt the weight of command most keenly. His men were young, some from Italy, many from Gaul and Hispania, even a few from Syria and Thrace. Rome drew soldiers from across her provinces, binding them together with discipline and the promise of citizenship. Around the fire their accents mingled, their songs mixed, yet when the horns sounded they moved as one. That was the miracle of the legions. 1,000 men, 1,000 lives, marching as though they shared a single will. The day began at dawn with the clang of the signal bell. Soldiers stumbled from their barracks, buckling on armor, gripping spears and shields. The morning drill was relentless, marching in formation, practicing thrusts with the gladius, hurling pila at straw dummies. Marcellus's voice cut through the mist, harsh but steady. Hold your line. Shield to shield. Thrust not slash. He had barked these words for years, yet he never tired of them. For he knew that discipline, not bravery, won battles. After drill came labor. Some men patrolled the roads, keeping bandits and rebels at bay. Others repaired the fort's defenses, hauling stone and timber to reinforce the walls. Still others dug ditches, sharpened stakes, or built watchtowers along the frontier. The army was as much builder as fighter, its hands shaping the empire as surely as its swords defended it. Marcellus often marveled at this truth, that Rome's strength lay not only in conquest, but in the order she imposed on wild lands. Meals were simple: barley porridge, bread, salted pork, sometimes beans or cheese. Wine was watered down, beer taken from the locals when the men craved variety. At night, fires burned in the barracks and the soldiers spoke of home, of vineyards in Italy, of wives waiting in Gaul, of the markets of Antioch, of the sun over Africa. Some carved wooden figures of gods to guard them, others gambled with dice, laughter mingling with curses. Marcellus allowed it, for he knew a legion needed both discipline and release. Yet always beyond the walls there lurked the enemy. The tribes of the north, painted warriors fierce in battle, watched from the forests, striking when least expected. Marcellus had seen their raids, swift, brutal, vanishing into the mist before pursuit could catch them. Only weeks before, a patrol had returned bloodied, half its men slain in an ambush. The survivors spoke of cries in the darkness, of spears raining from the trees, of painted faces glinting in torchlight. The memory haunted them still. On this day, as the sun sank low, a messenger arrived at the fort, his horse lathered with sweat. "Raiders in the north," he gasped, "villages burned." The horn sounded, and the fort stirred like a beast roused from slumber. Soldiers strapped on armor, tightened belts, checked blades. Marcellus stood at the gate, his face grim but steady as the sentry formed ranks before him. "We march at dawn," he said. "Rome answers with steel." That night, sleep came slowly. The barracks were filled with the murmur of voices, men sharpening swords, whispering prayers to Mars, to Jupiter, to their household gods far away. Marcellus sat alone by the fire, tracing the scar across his arm, a reminder of another battle, another raid. He thought of the men who would not return, of the widows left behind, of the empire that demanded sacrifice unending. Yet he also thought of the roads Rome had built, the peace she imposed, the order she spread across lands once wild. At dawn, the legionaries marched. The earth trembled beneath their boots, their shields glinted in the rising sun, their banners snapped in the wind. Ahead lay danger, blood, perhaps death, but behind them lay Rome, eternal, demanding, glorious. For the soldier there was no question, no hesitation. His life was bound to the empire, his duty etched into every scar, every weary stride. As the column vanished into the mist, the fort stood silent, a lone outpost of Rome in a hostile land. And in the heart of the centurion, there burned a single truth. Rome did not endure because of marble temples or golden feasts, but because men like him carried her eagle to the ends of the earth. And so Marcellus whispered as he raised his gladius to the sky, "Rome is here, at the edge of the world." The sun had barely risen when Marcus Flavius Severus gathered his toga around his shoulders and set out with Quintus toward the Forum Romanum. The streets of Rome were already alive with sound. Merchants calling from stalls, slaves sweeping dust from thresholds, mule carts groaning beneath their loads of amphorae. Yet as they neared the Capitoline Hill, the noise grew into a chorus, for here beat the heart of the empire, the place where Rome's destiny was debated, decreed, and displayed. The Forum opened before them in a blaze of marble and bronze. Temples rose on every side, their columns white against the blue sky, the Temple of Saturn with its ancient pillars, the gleaming Temple of Castor and Pollux, the vast Basilica Julia, where lawyers shouted arguments and clerks scratched notes onto wax tablets. Statues of generals and emperors lined the open square, each proclaiming Rome's victories across the world. In the center stood the rostra, its platform adorned with the prows of conquered ships, from which orators thundered words that shaped the fate of millions. Quintus's eyes widened as he took in the scene. "Father," he whispered, "is this where Rome rules the world?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Rome rules through many hands, my son, the Senate, the magistrates, the emperor himself. But yes, here you hear her voice." Crowds thronged the square, senators in gleaming togas edged with purple, clients clustering around their patrons, scribes carrying scrolls, soldiers in polished armor, peasants from the countryside gaping at the splendor. Voices overlapped in a storm of Latin, pleas, bargains, proclamations, gossip. The smell of incense from temple steps mingled with that of roasted meat from street vendors, the air itself a blend of devotion and commerce. Marcus led Quintus first to the Basilica Julia. Inside, its vast hall rang with the clash of voices. Advocates argued before magistrates, their words sharp as blades, while spectators craned to hear the verdicts. A slave accused of theft stood trembling as his master's advocate pleaded for mercy. At another table, merchants quarreled over debts, their contracts spread before the judge. Quintus tugged at his father's sleeve. "Why do they shout so?" Marcus leaned down. "Because words here are as mighty as swords. Rome is not only ruled by legions but by law." Leaving the basilica, they crossed toward the rostra. A young orator stood atop it, his toga flaring as he gestured, his voice rising above the din. He spoke of taxes, of roads left in disrepair, of governors who lined their pockets while provinces suffered. The crowd roared approval, some jeering, some applauding. Quintus gripped his father's hand. "Will the emperor hear him?" Marcus shook his head. "Perhaps, perhaps not. But the people hear, and that too has power." They paused before the Temple of Vesta, its round columns sheltering the sacred flame that symbolized Rome's eternal life. White-clad Vestal virgins moved silently about their duties, their faces serene. Marcus bowed his head, instructing Quintus to do the same. "As long as that flame burns," he murmured, "Rome endures." Quintus stared, awe in his eyes, for he felt in that moment the weight of centuries pressing upon a single hearth. Nearby, merchants hawked their wares, scrolls of poetry, jars of perfume, bolts of silk brought from the east. Julia, who had joined them with Livia later in the morning, was drawn to the stalls, her fingers brushing fabrics dyed in colors richer than any she had seen. Livia inspected pottery and jewelry, her keen eye weighing quality against price. Marcus allowed himself a smile. Even amid politics and gods, life's small pleasures thrived. As midday approached, they sought shade in the Basilica Aemilia, its columns cool against the sun. There Marcus greeted acquaintances, men who spoke of business, of contracts for grain shipments, of whispers from the Senate. Livia joined the circle of women nearby, who gossiped of marriages, scandals, and the latest decrees affecting dowries. Julia sat quietly at her mother's side, listening with wide eyes, while Quintus scribbled notes on a wax tablet his father had given him, eager to record what he had seen. The afternoon brought ceremonies. Trumpets blared as a procession entered the Forum. Magistrates in scarlet-edged togas, lictors carrying fasces, symbols of authority bound in rods of wood and iron. The crowd parted, murmuring reverently as sacrifices were led up the steps of the Temple of Jupiter. Priests in laurel crowns raised their voices in prayer, slaughtered the beasts, and examined the entrails for omens. The scent of blood and incense mingled, drifting across the Forum as the people cheered. Quintus wrinkled his nose at the sight, but Marcus placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "This too is Rome," he said quietly. "Power is not only in marble and words, but in the favor of the gods. Never forget it." As the day waned, the Forum's bustle softened. Shadows stretched across the marble, merchants closed their stalls, advocates rolled up their scrolls. Senators departed in clusters, their clients trailing behind like flocks of birds. The sacred flame flickered as the Vestals tended it, while beggars stretched out weary hands in the cooling air. Marcus led his family homeward, his toga dusty from the long day. Quintus walked close, his mind alight with questions, his heart swelling with pride and wonder. "Father," he said, "someday I wish to speak from the rostra, to have all Rome listen." Marcus smiled, though his eyes were thoughtful. "Then you must learn not only words, my son, but wisdom. Rome listens, yes, but she judges too." As the city settled into twilight, Marcus reflected on the day. The Forum was more than a place, it was Rome itself in miniature, its grandeur, its disputes, its faith, its ambition. Here marble shone, voices rose, gods listened, and the fate of the world was woven in words and deeds. And though battles raged on distant frontiers, though soldiers bled in rain and snow, it was here, in the heart of the empire, that Rome's soul was most visible. And so, as he gazed once more at the gleaming temples against the evening sky, Marcus whispered, "Rome lives not only by the sword but by the voice of her people." At dawn, Rome already pulsed with anticipation. A festival day had been declared, and with it came the promise of games in the Colosseum. The news had spread like wildfire through the city. Gladiators would fight, wild beasts would be loosed, and spectacles unseen in years would unfold before tens of thousands. For Marcus Flavius Severus and his family, it was both duty and privilege to attend. His patron had secured him seats not among the masses but in a section reserved for men of standing, where the view was clear and the shade more merciful. Quintus was awake before the sun, his eyes alight with excitement. "Father, will we see real lions?" he asked breathlessly. Julia, though nervous, clung to her mother's hand, whispering that she hoped the gladiators would be brave. Livia, more reserved, reminded her children to behave with dignity, for in the Colosseum as in the Forum, one's conduct was always seen. Marcus, adjusting his toga, smiled faintly. He knew the day would etch itself into his children's memories forever. The streets leading to the great amphitheater surged with humanity. Vendors shouted of fresh bread, roasted nuts, figs, and cups of watered wine. Hawkers offered little clay figurines of gladiators, miniature swords, and charms against bad luck. Beggars lined the road, stretching out their hands, while pickpockets moved through the press of bodies like fish in a river. Over all loomed the Colosseum itself, vast as a mountain, its tiers of arches soaring toward the sky, its walls alive with the thunder of the gathering crowd. As Marcus and his family approached, they passed under an archway carved with garlands and triumphal scenes. Guards directed the flow of people, senators and nobles through marble gates, plebeians through the higher entrances, slaves and foreigners to the uppermost tiers where the sun would beat hardest. Inside, the amphitheater unfolded in a vast oval of stone, its seats rising tier upon tier, filled already with thousands of voices blending into a single roar. The arena below lay empty for the moment, its sands smooth and waiting, the scent of dust and anticipation heavy in the air. Nets and iron bars enclosed the subterranean passages, where beasts and men alike prepared in darkness for their moment under the sun. Above, awnings of colored cloth stretched across part of the sky, shielding spectators from the glare, while standards bearing the emperor's insignia fluttered proudly in the breeze. Marcus led his family to their seats. From here they could see the imperial box, draped in purple, where the emperor would sit in state. Around it clustered senators, priests, and foreign envoys, their jeweled garments glimmering. Farther below, the wealthy reclined in comfort, their cushions soft, their servants attending them. Higher still, the plebeians packed the stone benches, their voices loudest of all, their passions unrestrained. At the very top, women of lower rank, slaves and foreigners leaned forward eagerly, their eyes fixed on the arena, their hearts as invested as any nobles. A trumpet sounded. The crowd hushed, then roared as the emperor himself entered the imperial box, raising his hand in greeting. He was flanked by lictors and guards, his robes gleaming with gold thread, his head crowned with laurel. At his gesture the games began. First came the Venatians, the beast hunts. Gates clanged open, and from the darkness surged wild animals brought from the far corners of the empire. Lions from Africa, leopards from Asia, bears from the forests of Germania. The crowd gasped and shouted as hunters armed with spears and nets faced the creatures, their movements swift, their courage desperate. Dust rose, blood spilled, and the amphitheater echoed with both cheers and groans. Julia clutched her mother's hand, torn between fear and fascination, while Quintus leaned forward, eyes wide, unable to look away. After the beasts came displays of exotic marvels, dancers from Egypt, chariots bearing gilded statues, and even a mock naval battle staged within the flooded arena. Slaves worked tirelessly behind the scenes, hauling ropes, pumping water, shifting scenery. To the crowd, it was magic. To those below, it was sweat and chains. At midday, the executions began. Criminals, condemned for theft or rebellion, were cast into the arena to face wild beasts or armed opponents. The crowd roared approval as justice was enacted before their eyes, Rome's order affirmed by the blood of the condemned. Marcus sat silently, his face stern, while Livia turned Julia's eyes away, whispering that some things were not for children to see. Quintus, however, stared grimly, perhaps sensing for the first time that Rome's glory was built on cruelty as well as grandeur. After a pause, the main spectacle began, the gladiatorial combats. Trumpets blared, and the gladiators entered in procession, their armor gleaming, their weapons raised. They came from every corner of the empire, Thracians with curved swords, Murmillos with heavy shields, Retiarii with nets and tridents. The crowd shouted their names, wagers were placed, garlands thrown. To the people, these men were both despised slaves and adored heroes, their courage a mirror of Rome's own. The matches began with lighter contests, pairs sparring to test their skill. But soon came the true battles, fights that pushed men to the edge of death. A Murmillo clashed with a Retiarius, the net whistling through the air, the sword flashing in the sun. A Secutor faced two opponents at once, his shield splintered, his armor dented. The crowd screamed approval, their voices rising in waves, their thumbs raised or lowered to signal mercy or doom. Marcus watched carefully, noting the discipline, the technique. To him, it was a reflection of the military virtues Rome prized: courage, endurance, skill in combat. Quintus, trembling with excitement, whispered that he wished to wield a sword one day, to stand unafraid before an enemy. Livia glanced at Marcus, her expression a mixture of pride and worry. Julia hid her face, peeking only when the crowd gasped, her heart torn between pity and awe. At last, a champion emerged, a gladiator undefeated in the arena, his name chanted by thousands. He stood bloodied but proud, his sword raised high, his eyes alight with the fire of survival. The emperor rose, extended his hand, and granted him freedom. The Colosseum thundered with approval, voices shaking the very stones. Flowers rained upon the sand, coins tossed by the wealthy gleamed in the dust. For one brief moment, a slave had become a hero, Rome's adoration his crown. As the sun dipped low, the games drew to a close. The crowd, hoarse from shouting, began to disperse. Vendors packed their wares, slaves swept the blood-stained sand, the arena grew silent once more. Marcus gathered his family, guiding them out through the throngs. Quintus spoke excitedly of the battles, Julia clung to her mother's side in silence, and Livia walked with thoughtful eyes. That night, as they sat together in their modest home, the echoes of the Colosseum still in their ears, Marcus reflected on what they had seen. "Remember, my children," he said softly, "Rome is not marble alone, nor laws, nor armies. She is also the roar of her people, the spectacle that binds them, the blood that feeds their hunger. Never forget the cost of her glory." And as the lamps burned low, the family fell silent, each lost in thought. For in the roar of the Colosseum, they had glimpsed both the splendor and the shadow of Rome's greatness. The morning sun filtered through the narrow windows of Marcus Flavius Severus's insula, casting golden bars of light across the stone floor. Quintus was already awake, clutching his wax tablet and stylus, his face a mixture of eagerness and dread. Today was another day of lessons, and though his mind brimmed with excitement from the Colosseum spectacle of the day before, he knew his father would expect him to set aside such distractions. In Rome, education was not amusement, it was preparation for the burdens of citizenship. Marcus adjusted his toga as he prepared to escort his son to the school of Marcus Fabius, a grammaticus of good reputation. "Remember, Quintus," he said, his voice steady but kind, "our city endures not only through strength of arms, but through wisdom and words. A Roman who cannot speak well is a soldier without a sword." Quintus nodded solemnly, clutching his writing tools tighter. Julia, standing in the doorway, sighed wistfully. "Why may I not go with you, father?" she asked. Livia placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Your lessons are here, little one, how to keep the household, how to honor the gods, how to weave the cloth that clothes us all. But who knows? Perhaps one day your father will let you sit beside your brother for a time." Julia's eyes brightened with hope, though she said no more. The streets were already alive as Marcus and Quintus made their way through the city. Bakers pulled fresh loaves from their ovens, their scent drifting through the air. Merchants arranged their stalls with scrolls, lamps, and jars of ink. Children with satchels hurried along, some chattering, others silent, each bound for the day's lessons. They arrived at the schoolhouse, a modest room off a busy street, its walls plain but lined with shelves of scrolls. Inside, boys of various ages sat on wooden stools, their wax tablets balanced on their knees, their voices mingling in uneven recitations. The grammaticus Marcus Fabius sat at the front. He was an older man, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. He greeted Marcus with a nod and gestured for Quintus to take his place. "Today," he announced, striking the floor lightly with a staff, "we turn once more to the verses of Virgil. Remember, to speak with beauty is to live with honor." The boys began to chant lines from the Aeneid, their voices rising in halting unison, some stumbling over words, others reciting with practiced ease. Quintus bent over his tablet, copying the lines with his stylus, careful not to smear the wax. His neighbor, a boy from Gaul named Lucius, whispered the meanings of unfamiliar words, while another, impatient, snickered at Quintus's slowness. The grammaticus's staff rapped sharply. "Silence. Rome was not built by mockery. Attend to your work." The boys fell quiet, their eyes fixed once more on their tablets. After the recitations came rhetoric. The grammaticus posed a question: which is greater, courage or wisdom? The boys raised their hands, eager to argue. One declared that courage won battles, another that wisdom prevented wars. Quintus hesitated, his mind turning over the lessons his father had taught him. At last he spoke: "Courage may win the day, but without wisdom, the day may be wasted. Rome is strong because she has both." The grammaticus's eyes softened. "Well spoken, Quintus Flavius. Remember that balance, for one day you may need it." The lessons continued with arithmetic and geometry, as the boys scratched figures onto their tablets and measured lines with string. They studied maps of the empire, tracing the roads from Britannia to Egypt, the seas that carried Rome's ships, the mountains that marked her borders. Quintus marveled at the breadth of it all, realizing for the first time how vast the world was, and how Rome bound it together. At midday the boys spilled into the street, their voices loud with relief. They ate simple meals, bread, cheese, fruit, while throwing knucklebones or chasing one another in quick games. Quintus shared his bread with Lucius, who told him stories of Gaul's forests and rivers, of druids long vanished, of battles his grandfather had fought before Rome's conquest. Quintus listened wide-eyed, understanding now that every boy in the school carried not only his own lessons but the memory of lands subdued by Rome. The afternoon brought philosophy. A philosopher hired by the grammaticus spoke to the boys of Stoicism, urging them to control their passions, to endure hardship with dignity, to live according to nature and reason. "The world is not ours to command," he said softly, "but ourselves we may govern." Some boys yawned, others whispered, but Quintus sat quietly, the words lodging in his heart. He thought of the gladiators he had seen, of their courage in the face of death, and wondered if they too had learned to master themselves in such a way. When lessons ended, Marcus returned to fetch his son. He listened as Quintus recited a passage he had memorized, his Latin steady, his voice strong. Pride flickered in Marcus's eyes, though he said little. As they walked home, Quintus spoke eagerly of Virgil, of maps, of Stoic wisdom. Marcus nodded, offering praise sparingly, for he knew too much indulgence softened a boy. Yet inwardly he was glad. Rome's future did not lie only in soldiers and farmers, but in men who could speak, argue, and reason. At home, Julia pestered her brother with questions. "What did you learn? Did you write on your tablet? Did you speak before the class?" Quintus, puffed with pride, recited a line from Virgil, his voice carrying through the small apartment. Julia clapped her hands in delight, begging him to teach her the words. Livia watched with a thoughtful smile, her hands busy with weaving, while Marcus sat in silence, his thoughts drifting. For though he cherished his son's progress, he knew education was not merely for knowledge. It was for survival. In a city where words could raise a man to honor or dash him into ruin, Quintus would need every lesson. The forum demanded eloquence, the courts demanded cunning, the empire demanded men who could lead. And in those demands, Marcus saw both opportunity and burden. That night, as Quintus fell asleep with his wax tablet beside him, Marcus whispered a prayer to the Lares, the household gods. Grant him wisdom, grant him strength. Let him serve Rome with honor, and may Rome in turn not devour him. For in the end, Marcus knew Rome was a teacher unlike any other, vast, relentless, and merciless to the unprepared.